Okay, we have Jeff Nyquist on the show. Welcome, Jeff, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I got so many questions, and they are split into sub questions. I'm trying not to be too overwhelming here. I want to pick your brain, and the first thing I'm interested in is how close do you think Russia and China are at the top? Are they one and the same empire? Are they partners on eye level? Or is one of them kind of a senior partner?
That's a good question. And of course, it's very difficult to know because both countries' governments are very opaque. That is, that they don't, both countries' governments are very secretive, and you cannot see, they make it so that you cannot see into what they're doing.
I've been telling that to people.
Outside, yeah. What's that?
Yeah, I always try to tell that people, they don't want to reveal their structure. They don't want to show their cards.
No. Now, my point of view is a little different. And of course, it's what I would say is, I don't know exactly, but it's something like this. If you look at China, for example, it's got the standard communist structures that were set up in 1949 when the Soviet China was formed, when Mao won the Civil War. And of course, there were lots of Russian advisors, Soviet advisors come into China to help set up all kinds of things. So China has the Soviet structures, like the countries in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, like the Soviet republics, like Cuba, and certain other communist countries, Vietnam, Korea, North Korea. And now there's a difference in China in that when the Mao's Cultural Revolution happened, some of the economic structures set up by the Soviet Union in China were torn down during Mao's Cultural Revolution. So that kind of explains what enabled China's economic liberalization. Some of those Soviet structures, because Mao, remember, went after the communist apparatus in China because he wanted this belief, direct control belief thing. And so they persecuted. They went after lower level party members and managers, and it was, the youth, the little red guards that were terrorizing everybody. And that was for, of course, Mao Zedong and Lin Biao, who headed the Cultural Revolution, and Madame Mao. That was sort of their game. Now, but at this very top structure of the party structures are connected to the World Communist Movement, which is a real structure. You used to talk about the Comintern, but there's whole kinds of organizations. Every communist party in the world is connected in some way to every other one. And some have been, of course, more oriented towards China or Russia during the Cold War. But that was something of a game, as we saw after the fall of the Soviet Union, in that there was a vast combining. The communist parties are always pretending to break down or split, but they're always together at some level, coordinating. We find out later. And so what happened in the Soviet Union, with the fall of the Soviet Union, is the Communist Party Soviet Union kind of went underground. You had the Communist Party of the Russian Federation appear, right? And the actual way that the party controlled things, the job seems to have been given to KGB people and Interior Ministry people.
Andropov.
And these oligarchs that now I have multiple different KGB and Russian sources that say, look, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, signed a contract with the KGB
to be a fake oligarch, right?
To be a billionaire, to be a real billionaire,
yeah.
But not a billionaire in the Western sense, not a billionaire that he made the money himself, but a billionaire like a gangster has a front man who handles businesses for him. He's not the real power. And in Russia, it's position, not money. See, the joke has been told, Treasury Secretary of the United States, first he makes millions of dollars on the stock market, then he becomes Treasury Secretary, right?
Yeah.
In Russia, it would be the other way around. The guy would become the position and then he'd make his millions. So it's what happened is that in Russia, these communist structures, which had to give up the appearance of the monopoly of power, gave it to the Siloviki, gave it to the power the power bureaucracies, and they had made these oligarchs, Boris Berezovsky, Guzinski. A lot of these people went off the rails and ended up dead or in jail. Right? It's the famous statement, exact same statement you hear from the Chinese billionaire defector Miles Guo. In an interview, he said, if you're a Chinese billionaire, you end up one of two ways, in dead or in jail. Same thing with a lot of Russian billionaires, Russian oligarchs. They end up dead or in jail, or they successfully break with Moscow and somehow survive, or they make a deal. So it's not really a capitalist free market system. It's not a democracy. So what's going on at the top? I believe from testimony, if you look at Russia's Secret Rulers by Timofeyev, or you look at Putin's Kleptocracy, these books, there's two ways to read them. Either criminal mafias took over Russia, or the Communist Party structures used criminal mafias in the police and the KGB to maintain control from an underground position. This is the theory that I believe is how it works. But unfortunately, see, in the best laid plans of mice and men in the Soviet Union, the problem is that when you don't have party structures providing ideological guidance and actually guiding the system, that power atrophies. It disintegrates. It becomes something that's not, there's an unintended consequence, right? The law of unintended consequences. So I believe at the top, the Chinese and Russian leaders are working together in this, as they are part of what they conceive of as a united communist bloc fighting for Marxism-Leninism. You see, Russian generals wearing the hammer and sickle flag on their as a patch here on their arm. You also see in when they set up the republics in Luhansk and Donetsk, you saw they had statues of Lenin out front. They had the Soviet flag out front. Right? You saw Russian tanks invading Ukraine, flying Soviet flags. What was this all about? And then you had this little clip. You had Medvedev, and he later denied it, but he said, we're going to restore the borders of the Soviet Union. Right? And then you had Shoigu saying, first we're going to restore the Soviet Union, then we're going to have peace. So this is where the top tier are, and I believe they're just like this with the Chinese.
But why is it that smart people, really smart people in the United States, like military officers, intelligence people, politicians, how come smart people in the United States have sort of accepted this idea over and over again that this idea that you could play China off against Russia and Russia off against China, and you could keep them sort of separate, and you could help one to weaken the other and that stuff? Because that always seemed to have been the excuse for helping Russia and China, right? There's always kind of this narrative that you take the pressure out of the whole situation by helping them, or you help one over the other and you play them off against each other. Why do smart people?
Well, there's a problem with your question. You're assuming they're smart, and they're not. Most people are pretty stupid. I would say I go back to the laws of stupid people. Most people are stupid, and there's more stupid people than you realize. And Nobel laureates can be stupid people. Professors can be stupid people. People that you think are stupid is a thing, and this is kind of almost a tongue-in-cheek. I'm giving you this. Stupid, the kind of stupid I'm talking about, exists in every class, race, group, and in the elite, everywhere. And and of course, humorously, I'm going to say the same proportion of stupidity is doled out to everybody, right? So to speak, by the gods. So you have all these stupid folks that you see. The primary thing about people that are stupid in this sense is they think they're smart. Now, let me ask you, what is smart about believing that an enemy who wants to destroy you, that is the world communist movement, can be split? And what makes you think that they don't realize you are trying to split them and that they won't play that against you, right?
Right.
Because they're going to play that against you if they realize you're doing that. And of course, this was what defector Anatoly Golitsyn warned the West. He said they're going to create a phony split, and the idea came from Tito-Stalin split, right? Stalin tried to assassinate Tito. Tito showed Stalin that he could, if he wanted to, assassinate Stalin back. So they kind of agreed to disagree, but they were enemies. And so the West rushed in to help Tito, who was a communist dictator. And the Russian strategists or the Soviet strategists were amazed. You mean that if there's an argument between two communists, the West will come in and help one of them?
They will buy this?
Right? Yeah, well, the Tito-Stalin split was real, but Tito didn't stop being a communist. So they realized the biggest problem they had in the 1940s after 49 was the Soviet Union did not have the wherewithal to build China into an industrial power. They just didn't have it. So how do they get China, which was extremely backward economically, a very small industrialized part of China, and just this huge, hundreds of millions of people living in subsistence farming. How do you rise up this nation? And you had to somehow get Western investment. And you couldn't just simply go to the West and say, hey, China is your friend now, come over. You had to create an information warfare campaign going through decades to get the West to believe, first, there was a split between Russia and China, and second, that split was so severe that that President Nixon would have to put bombers in the air to protect China from a Russian nuclear strike. I'm talking about the revelations of H.R. Haldeman's book, The Ends of Power, where he revealed that we were willing to go to nuclear war to protect China from an invasion supposedly by the Soviet Union in 1969, 1970s, something like that. And of course, if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you, a bridge to nowhere to sell you. There's the problem is that, of course, of this gullibility is that they needed somebody to come in and build up China. And so you have Mao dying. He meets with Nixon. Nixon goes to China. Kissinger goes to China. They meet. And of course, then Ford goes to China, and President Carter goes to China, and then they're solidifying step by step this trade relationship for us to build up China into an economic power, which is, by the way, a very stupid thing to do, is to build up communist China, the most populous communist country in the world, with one of the most ruthless dictatorships. When you make a partnership with Mao Zedong is the biggest mass murderer in the history of the world. So Nixon sits down with him, the biggest mass murderer in the world. And of course, this is not really to Mao's taste, but he needs to do this to get the ball rolling, because Mao knows what is going to happen. And when Deng takes over for Mao afterwards, Mr. Deng it's glorious to get rich and we're going to do this. But no, Deng says privately to his other party faithful, and we have the quotation, he says, don't be fooled. We're not abandoning socialism, right? We're just learning from the capitalists how to do capitalist business. We're allowing them to build us up for what we need. But in all future American presidents are our enemies. America's our enemy. And we haven't forgotten. We are part of the socialist camp, is what Deng Xiaoping told. And this has been quoted, by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping has alluded to this in other statements he made over the years. So it was not, they were taking advantage of us.
I mean, recently, the New York Times, right? The New York Times put out a commentary. This was maybe a week after this strange coup attempt in Russia by Prigozhin, and the New York Times then said, we should settle with the Russians over Ukraine. We can't be too harsh on the Russians with this sort of deal we're going to reach. And we need to appease Russia. We need to. Putin should stay in power because anything else would be too dangerous. And also, Russia needs appeasement because otherwise Russia would then get closer to China. So basically, at any time, at any point, with any situation, that trick could be played by just dangling that in front of everybody. You have to appease us, or else, there might be a big alliance between Russia and China. I mean, is anybody really dumb enough to buy this?
Oh yeah, well Henry Kissinger made his career out of this by you play the China card, right? You split Russia and China as if China and Russia were cards, right?
Yeah.
As if they were cards that you were playing in a game and you can play them on each other. The analogy is wrong. There's no the problem is, look at where the Kissinger thing got us. And who is Henry Kissinger? Why is this bad advice being given to our leaders? Henry Kissinger, I don't know if you probably know this, Henry Kissinger was accused of being a GRU, agent of the GRU, recruited by the Red Orchestra in Germany in 1945, in occupied Germany. And of course, Kissinger was a U.S. Army intelligence guy, and it's a very funny thing. It was Michael Golanowski, the number one British spy recruited in Polish military intelligence, who got this information and brought it to the British and the Americans, along with a lot of other things. Golanowski was a fantastic double agent working for the British, and he revealed a lot of spies in the West. But Henry Kissinger was one he named, and they just didn't believe him. They wouldn't look into Kissinger. And I think if you look at Kissinger's psychological profile, he has the profile of a spy. He is a severely narcissistic individual, if you look at his biography, his personal history. And I think that that Golanowski's accusation against Kissinger needs to be taken seriously to understand it. But I think also when I hear there's all kinds of bad advice, like you say, advice for appeasement to Russia, I always wonder where it's coming from. Because this is exactly what the Russians want us to think, what the Chinese want us to think. Because this is the divide and conquer game. They don't want us to realize that Russia and China are together. They want us, because then we would get stronger, because we would have to, in order to adapt to a world in which we have two enemies, we would have to adapt to having two. But if they tell us we only have one and we can always play the two off against each other, we don't have to build our navy as big, our army as big. We don't have to be as vigilant, right? And that also gives us the idea that we have some kind of special diplomatic mastery where we can go abracadabra and Russia becomes our friend or China becomes our friend. And there is no abracadabra. It's silly.
Well, during the George W. Bush administration, the official line basically was appease Russia, lure them to our side, right? Get them partially involved in NATO, have some sharing of information. Maybe one day they'll be part of NATO, they said. Just draw them in, because I think it's almost a direct quote, what Bush said to somebody, I don't remember exactly who it was. The quote was something like, we need Russia because eventually we're going to have to deal with China, and we need Russia on our side. And this coming from a guy like Bush, who's a member of Skull and Bones, and all these other bonesmen, they had so much to do with China and helping China and building China. I mean, did Bush believe this? And his colleagues, did they? What's their level of knowledge? What's their
Remember,
level?
the ancestors of these people did the Opium War on China.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I mean, look, the Anglo-American establishment thing. Look, the British and the Americans, and the British especially, were so dominant in trade and in the world economy. Remember that before 1830, I think China was the world's largest economy. You get Britain growing and expanding, and all of a sudden you get the Opium War, and Britain is the dominant trading economic power in the world. And that was a big transition. Of course, China had these tremendous weaknesses. It had this cultural arrogance. It was isolated. It looked at the Western barbarians, as they called them, as stupid and incapable, and it wasn't true. And of course, the imperial system in China was ossified. It was just senile. So it was destined to collapse. China had to, in order to interact with the West, it had to face up to this humiliating situation where their institutions and their way of thinking and doing things was not adequate to cope with the Europeans. And it's very hard to admit that your political system and your cultural system is not able to cope with some foreign power, set of powers. And they weren't. They just weren't. And so China went through this century of humiliation and collapse, more than a century, I would say, going through the Chinese Civil War all the way up to 1949. So the communists were the ones that claimed that they brought China out of this kind of situation. And of course, they saw, like people in India saw the Anglo-American establishment as the imperialists, right? They're the ones that did all these bad things to China and India and these other non-white countries. And of course, that was all blended in with Lenin's theory of imperialism, Marxism, Leninism, and this was part of the appeal of communism in China.
So
right?
you think those Bush types they just underestimated the communist system and communist abilities?
Well, I'll go back to this theory of stupidity. Okay, I'll just to give you an idea. Okay, you live in the German-speaking world, so we go back in history to the great Germans of the past, right? You go to Frederick the Great. You go and you deal with all the great figures of the Napoleonic period in Germany, and then you come up to Bismarck. First Metternich, right? Who was Austrian, but he's a German person, and they did these brilliant things. And then you go on and you got Bismarck, and then you've got Kaiser Wilhelm II, and then you've got Hitler, and now look at what you've got. You got Annalena Baerbock as your foreign minister. So tell me what the intelligence level of these people, what is the greatness or intellectual seriousness of the Germans over 200 and something years? How do you rate Germans? Okay, so the same thing goes for Americans and British. If you're going to go back to England, to William Pitt the Elder, William Pitt the Younger, right? Then you're going to go on and to all of the prime ministers under Queen Elizabeth. Queen Victoria the first, and then in Gladstone and Disraeli. And then you're going to end up in World War I with Asquith and whatever the other ones were. I can't remember at the time. And then you go to Winston Churchill, and now look at what you have. It is a degeneration, right?
So what do you think?
They're not what they used to be. And the same thing with the Americans. You got George Washington, and now you got Joe Biden. And then Kamala Harris after Joe Biden, when he croaks, is going to be Kamala Harris. So you see, there's a those things about evolution that you were shown. There's a little monkey there, and then
right, and then it goes all downhill.
Cro-Magnon man and human, right? Exactly. It's the reality is exactly the opposite. If you look at recent history, modernity, the monkey is now in charge.
So what do you think would be the winning strategy of Russia and China? What do you think is their most likely plan to succeed? What steps would they do next? So how would they win? How would they win if they get to be successful?
Okay, what you had, of course, you had the great Stalin, quote unquote, the helmsman of the Soviet Union, leading the whole communist movement at the time. And he won. He got to Berlin, right? He defeated Hitler. He won World War II. Then the Cold War starts, and Stalin dies, and his followers come after him. Khrushchev, Brezhnev. So Khrushchev in 1957 or so, just a year after Khrushchev denounced Stalin in the secret speech and said, Stalin wasn't everything he was cracked up to be, which is kind of convenient for Khrushchev. That basically they started a special commission or committee led by Leonid Brezhnev, who would become the future head of the Soviet Union, General Secretary of the Communist Party Soviet Union. And Brezhnev was the head of this committee because he was kind of friends with he was interested in strategy, Brezhnev was. And he was friends with the leading strategists, both in the army and the KGB, and the party. So he put this together. And on the military side, they had V.D. Sokolovsky, the Soviet marshal who had created the battle plan for the summer offensive of the Soviet army in 1944 that destroyed the German Army Group Center in 1944. And then you had Nikolai Mironov, a KGB head in Leningrad, who was an ideas guy. He believed in Sun Tzu, and he was a great disciple of Dzerzhinsky and Menzinsky, and this idea of the Operation Trust, doing controlled opposition on a big scale, and having counterintelligence that completely controls the mind of the enemy. These grandiose intelligence schemes, double games, you could say, scissors strategies. So you had these two, Sokolovsky and primarily Sokolovsky and Mironov, KGB and Army. Now, of course, Sokolovsky believed in Clausewitz, right? A much smarter Western style. Lenin and Marx believed in Clausewitz. And it's that, yeah, you can be clever and you can use deception. As Sun Tzu said, all warfare is based on deception. But that's really a mistake. Warfare is based on actually the willingness to spill blood, the willingness to fight and die. That's really how you win a war. You have to have more will to fight and die and spill blood than the other guy, and you have to be more capable of doing it. And that's what Sokolovsky believed. So Sokolovsky said, look, you got nuclear weapons, you got all these other new weapons coming, missile weapons, you're going to have a nuclear war. So you better get ready for it. Whereas Mironov is saying, look, we can do this. We can do a giant deception where we pretend to liberalize the Soviet Union in 40 years' time. And we get the West to disarm, and we can just converge. We can just take them over from the inside. We can use subversion and deception, and we can just take the whole thing over. And according to defector Anatoly Golitsyn, they brought the Chinese in on this too. And but what they did is they had an argument. They had a real argument, and the argument was, do we have to have a nuclear war in a world revolution for communism, or can we do it without a nuclear world war? And in this debate, they decided brilliantly, by the way, to use both dialectically. That, you have a left foot and a right foot, and each foot helps the other one walk. It's like your right foot's a mirror image of your left foot, right? They're kind of opposites, but they work together. So this is the idea. You have these two opposite strategies, you coordinate them together, and you move. So the threat of nuclear war moves people more over to accepting the deception that you're going to liberalize. And the liberalization helps get rid of the nuclear weapons that you're secretly still building, so that you can say, surprise, and the nice Russian rocket girl comes out of the cake and says, stick them up, right? Hand us all your stuff. So that's, I'm just kind of making fun, but I'm giving you kind of an idea of what the strategy was. And of course, according to Golitsyn and according to some other sources, they brought the Chinese in on this because it wasn't just a false liberalization they were going to attempt. And they had to prepare for decades the organizations in the Eastern Bloc that could have the controlled opposition movements. So they had to create the cadres, and they had to create the controlled liberalized parties and groups and dissidents and so on. Like Golitsyn argues that Andrei Sakharov was one of these, with his convergence ideas, the books that he wrote in the late 60s, the essays that he wrote. And of course, what we find out is Golitsyn, as a defector, as a KGB defector, who defected in 1961, he was part of a think tank in the KGB that was reorganizing the KGB in order to carry out this long-range strategy. And we also know about the Brezhnev Committee from another defector named Jan Shena, who talked about they were going to fake the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in the future. So we've got multiple defector sources saying they've got this grandiose plot to collapse communism in some way or fashion, and it's going to be a fraud. It's not going to be for real. And so Golitsyn, in his 1984 book describing this, the book's called New Lies for Old, Golitsyn makes 148 falsifiable predictions, by which by 1994, 140 of them have come true, right? And there's still more coming true now. Like, for example, to China, Russia emerging as allies against the West. That's happening now. That's one of his predictions. So he's got more than 94% of these right. And so but this is where people who listen to what I'm saying get it wrong. They either want to deny that this is real or that it means anything,
Sure.
or they want to claim that Gallitzin said that their strategy would necessarily work the way they envisioned it, right? Because there's a law of unintended consequences. So what happened when they carried out the strategy is they had a lot of missteps. You had the Berlin Wall went down the day before they were actually going to open it up. Okay, that was one misstep.
On live television they flubbed
Right.
the line, and
They they did it. They blew it themselves, and there were a lot of these little flubs. And you had, for example, you had the German Interior Minister, West German Interior Minister was supposed to die, but he survived the assassination attempt. You had a couple of his deputies flee to Moscow. You had all kinds of things that were supposed to go the way they wanted. But the number one thing, this is what a disgruntled former KGB officer who was at a fairly high level told me. He said the plan of unifying Germany was supposed to play out over 6-7 years. And as you know, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the creation of the unified Germany, it was about a year, right?
Right.
What October of 1990?
So what was the original plan? 2 separate states, or was it two unified?
It was to happen gradually. Now, the reason they wanted it to happen gradually is that way they could they wanted to control the process, and they needed it to be gradual to guide it, to make sure their agents in West Germany and other places would be in control of the process. And the whole key, and this is what I was told by sources in Moscow, the whole key to this working was that the German financial elite was not willing to give the money that was needed to integrate East Germany with West Germany. That's a very expensive proposition, right?
Right.
And so, but then there was a key German banker was assassinated, and I forget his name now. But this guy, the whole calculation by the Moscow strategists depended on him. He died, and the person that came in to replace him said, "Oh yeah, we can make the money available. Why not? We can make this work." And that what allowed this process that was going to take 6-7 years to happen in 1 year. And all of a sudden, and this was what was so disruptive, all of a sudden the Soviet armies in East Germany found themselves on the soil of a NATO country, because the unified Germany was a NATO country. And then you had, in these armies, you had specialists of various technical kinds that armies needed to function. Those specialists, by the dozens, if not by the hundreds, stepped off the bases and defected. So
how bad do you think? How badly do you think Germany today is infiltrated by the Russians and the Chinese? How can you even quantify, or how does one even quantify it?
Hundreds of thousands of agents.
Oh God!
Because you have East Germany, and you had the Russians have their own networks, and they were, before the unification, they were building networks in East Germany to be unleashed on the whole of Germany. They were building their networks up. And isn't it funny? I mean, what do you think of Angela Merkel? I mean, here's an East German communist gal who ends up being the head of the Christian Democratic Union. How does it? I mean, who is she? And is she a trustworthy person? And is she part of these? Was she part of these structures?
I mean, her father. I think her father could have been a double agent. I mean, he was very much part of the communist system. He was tasked with destroying or weakening the church in Eastern Germany. But at the same time, he had access to, or he could visit the West. They had relatives. And his office, reportedly, they lived at a sort of a farm in the woods. It was secluded. And according to reports, he had his office there stuffed with forbidden literature. And he would invite select students to read that literature with him and talk about it. So I think it may have been that he pretended to the West to be their asset of some sort. And maybe that's why that trust of the West in him carried over to his daughter. But this is just one of many possibilities this may have went down. The moment the wall came down, we had these freak chancellors: Angela Merkel, Gerhard Schröder, Olaf Scholz. They all have a communist background. They all had this insane appeasement towards Russia. I mean, literally, we went from sort of this conservative-leaning Western Germany, we went to these freak chancellors, one after the other.
Yeah, and the scandal that took the chancellor of the unified Germany was kind of interesting too. I think if we look at these chancellors in Germany, if we look at how infiltrated Germany is, what I would say is that Germany is a country that's very naive about Russia, because you have this, the spirit of Locarno, or the idea that at the end of World War I, both Germany and the Soviet Union were the losers of the war. And they sort of, Germany was under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, and the Soviet Union was kind of a pariah country. And so they actually could help each other out at the time. And there was this thinking, which even though when Hitler came to power, it seemed to go away, but Hitler himself ended up embracing it by his the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. That there was always this idea, and I think it goes back to Bismarck, because Bismarck had this thing is that Germany could be safe only if it stayed in the good graces with Russia. That Russia was the country that Germany needed most to be a partner with. And this was the thing that Kaiser Wilhelm II, who wanted to make Austria, another German country, to be his ally, caused no end of the break in the relationship, no end of trouble for Bismarck, because Bismarck is like, no, you do not. If you are allied with Austria, Russia's going to be mad at you. You're going to be at odds with Russia, which of course brought on the tragedy of the First World War. Bismarck could not explain rationally his insights, because it sounded like he was contradicting himself all the time when he would explain it. But Bismarck was right. Bismarck's intuitions, Bismarck was a diplomatic genius, right? He's kind of a political genius. He just knew in his bones what the right moves were. And the thing is though that when you get to the Soviet Union being Russia, when you get communism being this very different kind of, it's not Tsarist Russia anymore. It's not a conservative monarchy. You have this modernism, this very vile form of modernism, and you could say that both liberal Western modernism is problematic. There's problems with it, but communism, socialism, is just like an acid that just damages society at so many levels, and damages economy and damages people.
Well, they hate biology. I mean, they hate science when it contradicts them. They hate biology. They think people are empty vessels, and you can just make them whatever you intend to make them.
Oh yeah, But, that's very much embedded. It's a Frankenstein ideology. Yes. But
how come let's say the German right wing, the German right wing is infatuated with Russia, and they've been told, mostly from people on the internet, they've been told that by aligning with Russia, this will make the right-wingers' dreams come true. And this is how you defeat America, because if you have this Eurasian bloc, this will be strong enough to push back America. So it's this rampantly anti-American. And except for maybe during the Trump phase, I mean, this is the one moment when the German right wing was pro-America. I mean, what do you think the German conservative sphere, right wing, what do you think they should know about America? What would your message be to them to explain them what is the difference between Russia and America?
I think that I would try to explain to them more what is the difference between Germany and Russia, and what difference is there really between Germany and America. Because people can have a caricature view of a country. And one of the problems with the Germans, whether it was in World War I or especially World War II under the Nazis, is that the Germans had a very wrong idea of America. They didn't understand. This is one of the reasons why Hitler declared war on the United States. He did not understand Americans.
Yeah,
and so he didn't understand what he was doing. He didn't understand what he was doing by declaring war on us. And of course, his view of America as America is a complicated place in its own right. But what Germans need to understand is that America is profoundly Germanic in its culture. In its culture, it's astonishing to me when I read Tacitus, the Germanicus. He's writing about Germans in the 1st century AD, and he's describing people that the description fits modern Scandinavians and Germans, but it also fits Americans.
Right.
And it's like, that's just like Americans too. And you think about the fundamentals of American and German culture, it's like, well, there are ways in which we think like the Germans. And it's like, and America is more than one thing. You know,
it's all the engineering. That's what Hitler got. Hitler got so wrong about America. He did not understand that America is a nation of engineers. It's an engineering nation, and
it's very. America is. Remember that the original American colonists were mostly from England and Germany. Those are the two major. In fact, German was almost adopted as a language here. There's an awful lot of Germans, people of German heritage, and the English are, after all, largely they're Celtic and German people. The Saxons are Germans. The Scandinavians are Germans. All the Vikings that came in, into England. So they're really, it's incredible. Now there are the difference we have with the Germans, which I think turns off a lot of Germans, we had a Scottish Enlightenment. We had liberalism. We had the development of parliamentary government, and we had this development of this English system. And conservatism, Edmund Burke, we had this different way of thinking, which was not exactly full-on autocracy, and it wasn't Athenian democracy either. It was a mixed system, and it was really brilliantly articulated in the English by the most brilliant of the English, and the Americans picked up on it and did their own version of it, and because Germany, see, the difference between America and England and Germany and other continental great countries, there's a fundamental difference in psychology that we have to address between Oceania, the countries out in the ocean, Australia, Canada, America, Britain, and the continent. And that is, when you're a continental country, you really can't have the kind of institutions that England and America have. Not safely. And here's why. On a continent, you have enemies that have immediate access to attacking you. When you have the English Channel or the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, you have this barrier to which you have the ability to debate, to decide, to come to terms with different decisions. But Germany and France and Russia, particularly, never had that option. Spain never had that option. So their governments could never be as liberal, and it didn't make sense as the Anglo-Saxon people. And it was actually dangerous. Look at France. France is on its 5th republic and may shortly be on its 6th, right?
Right.
If things keep continuing in France as they are. Why 6? You have the French Revolution, you have the American Revolution. You have the Glorious Revolution in England in 1690. So what is it that that distinguishes them. The France, five republics, it's because the stresses of being a continental country, you have to have, and this was, de Gaulle was intelligent when he made the French Constitution more authority in the president. It was because you need that military element in the Constitution, the strengthening of the backbone of the authority of the center. You have to have it more. This is why autocracy works so long in Russia. Russia is exposed to invasion from every direction. They've been invaded by the Mongols, the Swedes, the Teutonic Knights, the Germans, the French, everybody, the Turks, everybody's invaded Russia. Russia's invaded everybody else too.
And by the way, before I forget that, this is what I tell people over here. The German right wing, right? Because when Russia invaded Ukraine, they had this narrative that they're fighting Nazis in Ukraine, right? And I had to tell people from the right wing what the Russians mean when they say Nazi. They mean white guy, and they mean all white guys. And this is what people don't understand because they don't read any books. I mean, from the days when Alexander Nevsky had to defend against the Teutonic Knights and the Swedes or the one of those
the Teutonic Knights.
Yeah, and I think some other white group out over there. So when Alexander Nevsky had to defend and he became this folk hero, it was the fight against the white guys, and later a fight against the Nazis. So the white guys, and when the Nazis were defeated, what other white guys were there as the enemy? It was Britain. It was Britain. It was the United States, because these people, as you said, they kind of have Northern European and Central European German roots. So those are the new Nazis. Every white guy is a Nazi to them, and this is what many people in the right wing do not understand. This is how the Russia define their enemy, and I mean, you have to tell that to people. You have to communicate that.
Well, there's of course, there's always, with ethnicity, there's these racial stereotypes and racism or ethnic prejudice is part of it. You had Hitler absolutely hated Slavs, and
Yes.
when he saw the movies, Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, recounted in his memoirs that when Hitler saw the films of the Ukrainian women laying the flowers on the German tanks, that Hitler just couldn't stand it. He looked away. He didn't want to see that these people were friendly to him, because he wanted to hate them, and he didn't want that to go on. He wanted to see a different thing. And of course, when various Third Reich officials said, look, we can make these people our allies, we can get all the manpower, all the no power. We could, in fact, General Sir John Fuller, who was a partial inventor, along with Little Hart, of the Blitzkrieg method of warfare that the German generals used. He wrote in his history of the Second World War that the Germans would have won the war if they'd only embraced the White Russians and the Ukrainians as allies against Moscow. They would have won the war, because they would have had all those people. You see how hard the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom. If you're going to give people their freedom to fight against Moscow, they will make weapons for you. They will set up factories. They will make things happen for you. You just give them the technology. You just give them a little bit, and they'll go a long way with it. And I think Fuller was right.
Well,
because that war was very close fought. It was very close.
Once the Russian invasion started, that really stumped the right wing over here, and I think even the United States. But I mean, I said in 2015, 2016, I said I guess starting with the year 2020, we will see military confrontations of a serious nature. So I thought it was going to start in 2020, but then came the pandemic, so it was 2022. I was not surprised, and I told people it is my job to be as I mean, no matter how good you are, you always get surprised, but you have to expect it. But in some ways, you're not supposed to go, oh my God, I would have never thought this, but you would at least be at that point to say, yeah, it's one of the scenarios I was thinking of. And so
and by the way, this was long in coming. I mean, in 2014, I wrote a book, I think in 2015, called The New Tactics of Global War. And what I couldn't understand was
I read that.
Why Putin didn't just invade Ukraine right away, because he would have won then, right? They would have won because the Ukrainians weren't ready, and they were losing. They'd lost the first two battles they fought in Donbass. They just simply didn't know what they were doing. But this is the proof that Putin is not that bright, is that he doesn't, everything is timing, right? You have to do things at the right time, and your strategy can't be what you should have done yesterday. You're doing belatedly because now it's not going to work. And so, it was obvious that once Putin annexed Crimea and once he went into Donbass, he was going to have to invade the whole.
Yeah.
And the earlier he invaded it, the better for him strategically, which is amazing that he didn't realize that. Because now he's in this severe pickle, this horrible situation.
And he needed the industry. I mean, he needed the industry in Ukraine, which was built during the Soviet days. And after 1991, Russia was unable to produce all these things on Russian soil. So that's also a thing that they needed.
Well, but Machiavelli... go ahead.
I mean, the right wing over here was so surprised, and for a moment they thought, and actually verbalized, well, actually the Russians are really different from us. I mean, what do we owe them? We actually owe them nothing. So many right wingers, they weren't actually, such big Russia supporters. They just pretended to be. They experimented with it because they thought it gave them some sort of international credibility, and they didn't expect Putin to do something that drastic. And so when the invasion happened, they were surprised, and they were kind of backing away from Russia, but then they sort of realized, well, we're just going to continue on with the pro-Russian thing. And something I wanted to ask you is, why do you think, and how big you think is the Russian influence, especially, of course, intelligence influence, over Western conspiracy media? Because that's sort of the backbone of the right wing here.
Yeah, no, it's big. I noticed this 20 years ago.
20 years ago?
Alex Jones.
Oh,
when
God.
9/11 happened, Alex Jones said it was an inside job right from the beginning. And that 9/11 is an inside job is a Russian propaganda thing. If you go to the
Russia benefited from 9/11.
Oh yeah, they did. They absolutely did, because 9/11 took the focus off of the United States. Was now complete. Its attention, as far as watching Russia and China, was completely taken away to chasing after a group of Arabs hiding out in caves.
Right.
Bombing. Planning to take down skyscrapers and set the Pentagon on fire with airline tickets and box cutters. That was the amazing thing, is that with just airline tickets and box cutters, you could bring down the Twin Towers and you could put the Pentagon on fire. This completely shocked the United States. I mean, people were walking around on that day, on 9/11. I saw people walking around in like a trance.
Right.
In this country. They were in shock. And the shock isn't conscious. It's a collective attempt to digest an event. I'll give you an example of how severe the psychological shock was. I was the security in charge of security staff of 3 different hospitals, and one of the things we did is that when people would run their battery down in their car, leave their lights on, we would go out and jump their car, or if they locked their keys in their car, we would get the Slim Jim and we would open the car. So that would happen maybe once a month in all the hospitals. One of my staff would have to do that. All of a sudden, 9/11 happens, and we're doing it 4, 5, 6 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I went out to the site, and one of my guys, they were with the janitor, engineering staff, was like showing them all their Slim Jims and stuff, and it's like, my staff had to be trained because depending on the car, you used a different way to, if they locked their keys in. And and so when I was there later, it was like a couple weeks later, it was still happening. And I remember this one guy left his lights on, and I said, hey, you left your lights on. You must have been preoccupied. All this stuff with the, war starting in Afghanistan and 9/11. He says, oh, no, that had nothing to do with it. And it's like, I know it did, because it all started right with 9/11. That suddenly you have this phenomenon, right? That when you run your staff, you see what your staff is doing. If they're doing something now 6 times a day that they were doing once or twice a month, there's got to be a cause, right? And it's psychological.
But wasn't it even in I think it was in 1995 when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, right? I mean, the first reaction of, let's say, the conspiracy culture, or let's say people from the John Birch line of that sort of research. The first reaction was Oklahoma City was an inside job, and this all this was premeditated. And at the same time, other researchers said, but wasn't Timothy McVeigh a reader of the same type of conspiracy literature? I mean, he thought the New World Order was coming next week and something, and the United Nations tanks would roll through America, and the patriots would be disarmed and put into concentration camps. This is what McVeigh believed in the early 90s, and he thought time was of the essence. Somebody has to do something, and so it was kind of like he was a conspiracy culture guy. But then it became an embarrassment for conspiracy culture when he did the bombing, and so conspiracy culture said, no, he wasn't one of us. He was one of them. He was one of the government. He was part of the government conspiracy. So I think when 9/11 happened, and let's say Alex Jones said on the same day, I believe it was, so this was an inside job, I think this was just a standard operating procedure, right? Because of that, because it's just there's no other thing on their mind. And I think Jones, at some point, I think this was during the Trump era, Jones said on his show, for the last 10 years, he has barely read any book whatsoever because he just does not have the time. And so I think even in the 2000s, during the Bush era, I think he just lacked knowledge because he was so busy with, hosting and whatever, he wasn't reading. But by the time 2008 happened and the Bush era was gone, it was the Obama era, I think this is when in 2008, this is when this whole big Russian plan really came to fruition. The Russian plan to influence conspiracy culture, and then you saw more pro-Russian guests on Jones.
I think it goes back to the
became so much worse.
I think it goes back to the 1950s, to be honest, with a speech that Khrushchev gave in 1957. But just to mention, talking about Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh was a right-wing conspiracy guy. He went to federal prison where he got to know a left-wing conspiracy guy named Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Wait,
hold on. They were in the same prison?
Yep, they were in the same prison because they were maximum security prisoners,
I didn't know that.
They were dangerous. They were both bombers. Ted Kaczynski was a Unabomber. He'd blown up a lot of people. Timothy McVeigh blew up a lot of people. So they ended up, it's not surprising they ended up in the same place. So they became friends. And Ted Kaczynski was, after Timothy McVeigh was executed, of course. Kaczynski wasn't, but they gave the death penalty to McVeigh. So Ted Kaczynski gave an interview with a journalist after McVeigh was executed because they knew he was a friend. And it was very interesting what Ted Kaczynski said about McVeigh. He said, Tim was a great guy. And Tim had this idea that we should get together. That is, the far left and the far right should get together because we have the same enemy, right? Mm-hmm. that is sort of a key, and it isn't, if it came as a revelation to Ted Kaczynski to hear this from McVeigh, it was not a revelation in Moscow, because in 1957 Khrushchev made a speech, and he said, our biggest problem is in America, they have these anti-communist groups in America. And so what we need to do is we need to infiltrate them, and we need to create our own anti-communist group in America that will then basically destroy anti-communism as a movement. Now, how do you do that? How do you create your own anti-communist movement that actually destroys anti-communism? Well, the year after, by coincidence, the year after Khrushchev made this speech about, we have to get into the anti-communist business in America, the John Birch Society was founded in December of 1958 by Robert Welch. And Robert Welch, the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, if you read it, it's a very interesting document. Robert Welch says, he's opposing communism, he's opposing the Soviet Union, but the fine print is, in the Birch movement, is that the Soviet Union the Cold War is sort of a fraud, and the Soviet Union isn't the real enemy. The real enemy is somebody else. And as you read the Birch literature, what you find out is the real enemy of the Birchers isn't the communists. It is a elite group of capitalists, the insiders, who basically are responsible for capitalism, for communism, and for everything else that's bad in the capitalist world.
Right.
So that's a conspiracy above the conspiracy the Birchers talk about. And this is one of the reasons why William F. Buckley turned against the Birch Society in 1963 or 64, I think it was. So what was the Birch Society doing? If you look at the Birch Society ideology, it essentially is the exact same. They're fighting the exact same enemy ultimately that the communists want to overthrow.
The capitalists.
So there are these capitalists, right? So there's books that the Birch Society publish on the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. That's the center of the conspiracy, right? Well, because I was a political scientist and a scholar, I had written a book written by a communist about the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations. This guy was a Marxist-Leninist, and he said, this is the core of the capitalist conspiracy, the Trilateral Commission, and we have to know what they do, and we have to combat what the Council on Foreign Relations if we're going to make the revolution work throughout the world. So then I'm reading a Birch book, which is about the same thing, saying the same thing. The
same thing, yeah. I mean,
but
I always said
extensively from the right, right?
I always said. I mean, I had the impression that the John Birch Society was making this sort of black and white distinction, right? So on the one hand, they show you the bad capitalists, kind of the Rockefellers and those guys. And on the other hand, they promoted the so-called good billionaires. Some like one of the Nelson Hunt, the Hunt guy, the one of the
Hunt brothers.
Yeah, exactly. So
supposedly the gold market.
Right. So supposedly you should trust these billionaires over there, but not those billionaires over there. And that was kind of this distinction. And what irritated me about the JBS was that they told people to not create their own organizations, just to follow certain organizations and to follow certain billionaires, because they are sort of a positive conspiracy. They're working behind the scenes, and they will eventually one day save America. So you have to spread JBS stuff, and one of the days the salvation will come. But it never came. I mean, as you said, it was founded in the 50s, and then nothing really happened. Nobody came to save us. And then, somebody in the 1990s, somebody like Timothy McVeigh was going insane because there was nobody coming to save them, and that's why he did the bombing. And nowadays, especially in the Trump era, and the Trumps have connections to the Birch Society, right? And I saw, especially young people getting into this sort of activism. I saw them panicked. I mean, they sounded like Timothy McVeigh in the early 90s, and I told them, just don't make any stupid, rash choices, because that's what Timothy McVeigh did. He was going nuts in the early 90s. He expected the big attack to come soon, but then, now it's 30 years later.
And this is where there's a National Socialist angle, believe it or not, in all this. which is even more incredible, is you've got Elohim City and the connection of McVeigh to Elohim City and to possible East German agents, formerly East German agents. You've got as well, you have with Robert Welch, you have all of these people who later emerged in sort of the neo-Nazi movement in America, like Willis Carto, who worked for Robert Welch. Willis Carto was the longtime publisher of the Spotlight, of the Institute for Historical Review, which is they're basically Hitler apologists. They're trying to give the pro-Hitler version of World War II, right? And then you have Revlo Oliver, who was a very important writer. He's a very brilliant writer, by the way, brilliant polemicist, who wrote for the Robert Welch's magazine, American Opinion, I think it was called at the time. And Revlo Oliver is interesting because he was a closet kind of anti-Semite who later wrote a memoir, I think in 1966, about why he broke with Robert Welch. He said, Robert Welch believes the same thing I believe. That is, that there's this Jewish conspiracy. And of course, he said that he called him the Welcher because he would never come out with what he believed. And of course, when you see that Taylor Caldwell, also the novelist who was also an anti-Semite, I mean, all these people were close to Robert Welch and helped form this thing at the beginning. And so what I had to conclude was that there was this, if you look at anti-Semitism, one of the earlier Marx's writings called On the Jewish Question, where Marx uses the Jew, so to speak, as a metaphor for the capitalist, right? So that the idea of the Jewish banker is associated with capitalism in the mind of Karl Marx.
And he took that from
anti-Semitic things.
and he took that from even earlier early French socialists. Those ideas.
Right. Yeah, and there was a linkage between socialism and anti-Semitism. There's a linkage going. You could say that it's been said that anti-Semitism is the stupid man's Marxism, right? Because Marxism is this super convoluted, philosophically sophisticated explanation for why we have to go to socialism. Whereas anti-Semitism is just this very emotional, ethnocentric, you just point to some group that people, are prejudiced against, and you use the stereotype of the Jewish banker or the Jewish merchant, whatever the stereotype out of Shakespeare, right?
The Merchant of Venice.
The Merchant of Venice, right? Where you're talking about, what was his name? The Jewish character in The Merchant of Venice. He's sort of a stereotype.
Exactly, he's a stereotype. Yeah.
So you use that to characterize what capitalism is about, and so when you get to Hitler, Hitler really was learned from the Marxists, but also created his own thing that you look at Putin and Xi. Putin and Xi learned from Hitler, because what Hitler taught the Marxists was people aren't going to fight for that abstract nonsense, Marxist nonsense.
They need a god. They need a leader. They need a god.
But also they need a leader. But they will fight for their nation. They'll fight for their ethnic group. So then Great Han. Then you see in the last decade China moving to this Great Han nationalism. Even though they're still emphasizing Maoism and Marxism-Leninism, they're then bringing Greater Han nationalism into it because they're preparing for a war.
And that's how the Chinese, and that's how the Chinese nowadays woo the conservatives. Because this was just into over the last couple of days. The far right wing party in Germany, the far right wing, the AfD party. They're moving closer and closer to Russia. Now, why would a right-wing party move closer to a communist nation? But I said this was going to happen. The Chinese are marketing themselves as sort of nationalists. They point to their 5,000 whatever years of culture and their ethnic makeup and their borders and all that. So they're trying to appeal, they're trying to look good to the nationalists over here and to the right wing over here. Apparently that's working.
Yeah, and of course this Greater Han nationalism in China is quite phony. It's an artifact of a state that's just, this is like Stalin calling his war against Hitler the Great Patriotic War, because he's a communist. His regime is communist, and he's fighting Hitler, and he realizes his people are not going to fight for Marxism, but they will fight for the Rodina. They'll fight for Mother Russia, right?
Yeah.
So that's what it becomes, because Stalin then has shown that he can learn from Hitler, right? He can learn from him. So that is the great flexibility of the communists. They were profoundly, both Lenin and Stalin and Mao were profound realists. And so, but that confuses people in the West, because then they think that Putin is genuinely, when they start this Novorussia, they start the new Russia thing, they think this is genuine. But if you talk to a real deep Russian nationalist who understands Russian history and culture and wants to preserve it, he will tell you that Putin is importing labor from Central Asia into Moscow, and they built the biggest mosque in the world in Moscow for those Muslims who are coming in to take Russian jobs. Putin doesn't give a hoot about the Russian people. He'll bring in as many Muslims as he has as laborers for his economy and for his buddies, and they don't really care. He's not a genuine nationalist.
Right. I mean, it's not surprising. It's not surprising that Russia today is using the Western conspiracy culture for its own advantage. So they've kind of engineered the modern propaganda to make it fit. So right-wingers believe over here, and as well in America, they believe Putin will save them from the Rockefeller types, from those kind of circles, Klaus Schwab, Bill Gates, and sort of things. So they think they have an ally in Russia, and they're going to help them against those guys. And so, what would you tell people? What is a good way to measure if somebody is trustworthy and educated or not? Because you can't go by the John Birch thing. You can't just use that as your handbook and your guideline. And even people associated with the JBS and the Council for National Policy. I mean, I've seen so many differing opinions, and they can't make up their mind who is a good guy, who's a bad guy, and what is up. So what would be a good handbook, a good guideline, how to judge or determine if somebody is trustworthy and has a reasonable standpoint?
Well,
they have to read books. They would have to read books, right?
Yes,
I mean, if somebody doesn't read, stay away from that person, man. It's just...
That's exactly right. Well, I was just going to quote my friend, the late Olavo de Carvalho, who was the philosophical mentor to President Bolsonaro, but the great Brazilian philosopher and thinker. He has famously said that you cannot trust uncultured people.
Yes, exactly.
You can't trust them, because they will, and this goes again to the one of my readers posted the 5 laws of stupidity on my site. It's brilliant, because stupid people are more dangerous than enemies, is one of the things to know about stupidity. And why? Because
you underestimate the stupid people.
Well, the stupid people are unpredictable and will do things. See, a stupid person will do something to hurt you that hurts themselves.
Exactly.
And you can't...
You don't expect that to happen.
Right. You don't expect... It's like...
You expect this from an enemy. Exactly. An enemy is more predictable. You expect your enemy
to try to hurt you, but it's just like... Look at this. It's like with the nuclear balance of terror. They're not going to use their weapons on us because they'll get hurt too, right? But a stupid person with nuclear weapons will use the nuclear weapons on you because he'll do something that hurts him as bad or worse than it hurts you. And you'll say to him, why are you destroying yourself by destroying me? Why are you doing that? That's like out of left field, and they won't understand what you're saying. And they'll do it without any warning. You won't have any warning that they're going to do this. So, and of course, if you're navigating in the world, if you're trying to do political activity, you want to be able to calculate, what it is you need to do, what strategies are going to work, who your enemies and friends. The first rule in politics, famously, Carl Schmitt, the German jurist who he wrote his book, The Concept of the Political, in 1927, if I remember right. He said the number one thing in politics is know who your friends are and know who your enemies. And the primary distinction in politics is the friend-enemy distinction. And it really is a profound insight.
Yes.
But then we have this stupid, not stupid distinction, which Schmitt didn't write about, which is know who the stupid people are and stay away from them. Keep them out. Because the stupid people can do damage to you at any moment at the drop of a hat for no reason at all. It's completely arbitrary.
It's the Dunning-Kruger. It's this Dunning-Kruger effect. People are not experienced in a topic at all, but they think they are. They think they're brilliant, and they will get angry if you question them. And I tend to tell people, the feeling of the emotion of being right, of being correct, is almost the same whether you are actually right or you're completely wrong, whether you've spent the time researching the subject or you haven't spent it. So just by having that feeling, it doesn't mean anything because, everybody can get that feeling, even if they're wrong.
Yeah.
So
that's absolutely correct.
And the thing is about the thing I noticed. I mean, ever since 2008, and Russia really kind of took over alternative media, or whatever you want to call it, right? So what I noticed is that there's always just a few baseline rules of propaganda. So if something happened, some shocking thing happened, must be a Western conspiracy. You are not to follow any hint that may lead to Russia. The answer is always give Russia more power that will solve your problem. So it became like this thing on repeat, and it was used so often that the audience started to expect it and demand it. So I'm not just criticizing certain influencers, but I'm also criticizing large parts of the audience because they demand the nonsense and they will pay for it and they will punish you if you don't give them that nonsense.
That's right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's, and whereas it started long ago, the Birch Society was an early experiment. The LaRouche movement was an early experiment.
Oh God, those guys.
The LaRouche movement is definitely part of this. I mean, he was a teacher of Marxism-Leninism here in the U.S., and LaRouche wanted to form a right-wing Marxist party. In 1971, he founded, with help from the KGB, by the way, the U.S. Labor Party. It was an experiment, but these experiments have become progressively over time more successful. So that now, and it's just happened since Trump, we're in danger of seeing the right in America and Germany and other, just completely taken over by basically Russian agents of influence who have basically penetrated the right in Germany, in the United States. And I can kind of guess who they are, because I can kind of watch who's doing what. I could see the pattern. I know the names. I'm not going to say them.
Yeah, and you've seen. I mean, you've probably seen. I don't know, hundreds, thousands of examples, confirmed examples in the literature of confirmed spies that were their cover was blown. So you know the story. So you know how they act, and now you see people today acting in the exact same. With the exact same pattern. So there's no other human being on Earth who would act exactly like this. There's only Russian spies who act like this.
Yeah, these are people who. How you identify an agent of influence in this kind of game? And by the way, as Yuri Bezmenov testified, mostly what Russian agents do, mostly what they do is influence. 80% influence and 20% spying. It's mostly influence operations. And how you identify them is that First of all, it's a person who, if you know their background well enough, if you get to study them, they know better than what they're saying. And in fact, you can even find evidence that they have said in the past very different things, so that they know what they're saying ain't so, as we would say in America. And so that's one marker. The other marker is that when you can tell something's disinformation, the person, when people are, remember, repetition, as Hitler said in Mein Kampf, repetition, simplicity and repetition are the two keys to getting people, to change what they think. You repeat it over and over again, and you make it simple so anyone can absorb it. Well, that also, by the way, for an intelligent person, it makes the message boring.
Yeah.
You're hearing it all again. It's kind of old. It becomes stale pretty quickly. So when you look at somebody who's more intelligent than the stale stuff they're producing, and that even when they're trying to be sophisticated, it comes across as dull. Right? That's it. That's necessary.
Because reality, because I tell it to be, reality is surprising. There's always something new, or
yes.
So reality is surprising, but dull propaganda is so predictable because it's meant to be a certain way. But reality is always
because propaganda has to be, as Hitler had said, and also Goebbels said this about propaganda. It has to be repetitive. You have to repeat this. You have to drill it into their head. But see, the average person is kind of in a semi-hypnotic state. They're not. Most people aren't thinking. They are just absorbing, and they go through life that way. So that it's like Albert J. Nock, who wrote Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. He said, "You can train a monkey, but you can't educate a monkey." And he said, 97% of the people going to the Ivy League schools are monkeys. Let alone everyone else. And it's sort of like the 5 laws of stupidity. People are there are more stupid people than you realize, right? So this is what it's aimed, but if you're alive, if you're intellectually alive, and what you said was brilliant. It is reality is full of these neat surprises, and what's so exciting about learning and exploring and discussing things is that, oh my gosh, something new again, this is such an interesting tie-in.
Yeah.
But that literature does not have anything really interesting in it. It's boring to a mind that's alive. So whenever I read something and it's highly praised as being important and seminal and whatever, and it's boring, when you look closer, you go, wait a minute, this isn't even true. This is propaganda. Someone's being put up to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's different markers, and being boring is one marker. Knowing better than the nonsense they're talking is another marker. And of course, it's the unmotivated. It's like when they attack somebody, like in the political battle, you'll see certain people get targeted and get destroyed, the politics of destruction. And you say, why? What is and when you realize they don't have a personal motive and they don't have an honest intellectual motive for doing it, they don't have a real disagreement. A good example is what was done to Diana West, the writer on anti-communism some years ago. Diana West wrote a book called American Betrayal. About 10 years ago it came out. And in American Betrayal, Diana West documented how communists had, in the 1930s, once FDR had opened a Soviet embassy and we had relations, suddenly the communists they flooded into government. You had, like 5,000 communists in the government, and the FBI warning FDR, and FDR saying, no, it's not a problem. And then you had all these, the Venona decrypts came out, and there were like 320-something Soviet agents working in the FDR White House in 1943 during the war. And so she's documenting how the Stalin's agents, and there's also books on this, Stalin's Secret Agents, by Stan Evans and I forget the other author's name, about how their whole game was they wanted World War II to drag out. There were lots of Germans that wanted to overthrow Hitler and be done with the war and have a negotiation, but they wouldn't allow a separate peace with the West, right? They wouldn't allow that. And so these agents made sure the war was fought in a certain way that benefited the Soviet Union. And so Diana West documents how these Soviet agents influenced the war strategy of the United States, which was the dominant of the Western
Holy moly.
kind of dominant one. And of course, you had Martin Bormann, Hitler's traitor. You had Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller in Germany doing the same thing with Hitler. Influencing Hitler the same way these people influenced FDR, so that the war would come out the way that Stalin wanted. And you look at the Battle of the Bulge. Ask your question: why? How does Germany come up with two Panzer armies off the Eastern Front on the Americans, hit the Americans on December 16th, 1944? Why? The big armies coming in are from the east.
Right.
What are you going up to the Rhine, to the way? You got the West Wall. You got this great fortified line. Hide behind it. What are you pulling out mobile Panzer?
So this Diana West was getting into the interesting stuff, and what happened to her?
Well, Diana West was of course the Battle of the Bulge stuff is my own investigation, but Diana West is getting into this sort of stuff, like why not try to invade up through Italy into Austria? Why not? Because it would obviously, if the Western Allies went into the Balkans, Stalin couldn't get into the Balkans, right? So there's all these interesting things she brings up. So what happens to Diana West? She gets attacked. It's very interesting. She gets massively attacked. And who is it? It's David Horowitz. It's Ron Radish. It's Harvey Clare and John Haynes. And these are
what kind of type are those?
They're former left-wing or communist people who converted under the time of Reagan to being conservatives, who now have conservative credentials. And of course, you could not hurt Diana West's reputation if you were a communist and you attacked her for writing the book. But if you're ostensibly on the right and you attack Diana from the right, then you can discredit her, you see. Now, the thing that gives them away with this particular thing that happened was that this is what they did. Like Ron Radish, he would say, there's this error in her book on page whatever. She makes this accusation about Harry Hopkins on this page. Well, I remember when I read Radish's thing, I had her book, I went to that page and I go, well, that's not there. Well, Diana did the same thing. She challenged him to a debate. She says, it's not on that page of my book. Where did I write this, supposedly? You write a book, you don't remember everything you wrote. And of course, then he made up another page when he responded to her on, I believe it was Breitbart, and it's not on that page either. Think about how cynical that is. So he basically, what they did is, all of them did it, Horowitz, Clare, Haynes, Radish, they made up things about her book, blackened her name with those accusations about what was in her book, and those things weren't even in her book. So they, by the way, they were in a perfect position to know they were lying. So here's the motivation. They're all supposedly anti-communists, and they've written supposedly books about communist infiltration, which are very interesting because there's errors in their books about communism. For example, the denial by Haynes and Clare that Russia ever attempted to influence policy in the United States, that Russian agents, Soviet agents never influenced policy in the U.S.
Oh, God.
That's in their books, which is incredible. And then they're attacking her, and it's like, this is so simple to see who they are, right? It's like, who would do that so the thing is, you're a scholar, she writes this book, so you invent a lie about her book, cynically knowing that nobody reads and no one will check. And you destroy her reputation, because all people have to do to preserve her reputation is open the book and say, well, she doesn't say that. But people just accept, what is told to them. And so then you look at Horowitz's background, and when I look closer at Horowitz, supposedly turned against communism because his secretary at Ramparts magazine, Betty Van Patten, he got her to be an accountant at the Black Panthers, and she was tortured and murdered by the Black Panthers, and her body was dumped in Oakland Bay. And so he supposedly felt horribly guilty, realizing that communists were murderers, and so then he became a pro-Reagan Republican, right? And it's in his book, Radical Son. So that's David Horowitz, who led the charge on attacking her, by the way. It was her publications that led the charge on attacking. So guess what? I thought, I got to check into this guy. So I find an article from the San Francisco Chronicle by Betty Van Patten's daughter, and she says, David Horowitz is a liar. My mother was never his friend. He didn't get her the job. I think, if I remember right, he didn't get her the job at the Black Panthers, and she never trusted him. And so that he's he's made up a story about why he's no longer a communist. It's not true. From Betty Van Papen's daughter. So just think about that for a minute. And so who's an agent of influence, right? So years later, David Horowitz is with the WikiLeaks guy who's in the Ecuadorian embassy. Julian Assange. He's being interviewed by Julian Assange, and with Julian Assange there in the Ecuadorian embassy is Slavoj Žižek, right?
Oh, no.
The Slovenian communist. And they're having, supposedly, Horowitz is going to be debating with Slavoj Žižek. It's fabulous. I've watched it so many times because it's so great. Žižek is such a wonderful clown. He's a, convinced Leninist, of course, a communist. But Žižek, all of a sudden, he's listening to Horowitz, and he suddenly has an epiphany. When he's listening to Horowitz, he goes, I know what you are. You're a communist with a human face. And then he laughs.
Okay.
I kid you not. You could go back and listen to it. And it's like Žižek realizes who Horowitz really is in the middle of the interview.
Oh, no. Oh, that's funny.
Yes, because Žižek pretended to be a nationalist. Remember, Žižek was a Yugoslav communist who became a Slovenian nationalist and then went back to being a communist again. So ask yourself what the game was that Žižek was playing in Yugoslavia when the defector Jan Šejna says in his book, written in 1982, that the plan of the communist bloc is to break up Yugoslavia in the future along ethnic lines and to manage it as different countries. This is in the defector literature. 1982, we will bury you, Jan Šejna, one of the highest level communist officials of communist Czechoslovakia. Yeah, we're planning after Tito's death to break up Yugoslavia along ethnic lines. So there's Slavoj Žižek being part of the breakup and then running back and being a communist again.
Many people are, or most people are completely untrained to judge other people, to make an assessment, and this is sort of the baseline intelligence techniques that I think skills that everybody should have, right? You're being methodical, you're collecting information, and you're just trying to gauge who somebody is. You're not jumping to conclusions. I think these skills are so lacking, and that's why when you discuss a certain person, you discuss a certain idea, that some people, they get confused because they do not know how to judge if this is true or this guy is bad, and usually most of the time people who are untrained, they just want a mass movement, because then you just have to shut off your brain, you just follow along, right? Because there's unity,
there's repeated thing. Yeah,
there's unity,
goes round and round.
There's unity, and they feel they're among friends and brothers, and they don't have to judge anything. They don't have to judge anybody.
No.
But it is a skill. I mean, it is really a skill that people need to acquire, and one way to acquire that skill, or at least partially, is to read actual literature on actual intelligence agencies and agents who got blown, and missions that went sideways, and missions that got blown. Because how else are you going to get sort of into the thing, right?
Yeah. Well, another useful thing is to read Socratic dialogues, read about Socrates. And here's why I say that. The number one thing you can do is ask questions. For example, the number one question is, why did he say that? Or why did he do that particular thing? You see? And the thing is that there actually is a reason why people say, sometimes with stupid people, there's no reason. They're just repeating something they've heard, or they're obsessed with something. But when you're talking about strategy of a game of mixed chance and skill, if somebody is playing you, or they're playing a game with you, there is a definite reason for everything they do. And so it isn't just that you listen to what people say, you have to listen to what they do and why they say it. And then when you realize there's a pattern, as you mentioned patterns before, you go, oh crap, wait a minute, this guy is not what I thought he was. And this is the key thing, is look, it's very important for people when they're trying to manipulate you to lie to you or deceive you. because deception and lying is the first step. The last step is they kill you, right? Or they rob you. But lying is one of the key things along the way. They get you to believe something that's not true, to distract you, to cause you to lose your position, to cause your country to lose its way, and then they can exploit that. But they have to get you there. And so always ask, when you're looking at, you're in Germany, look at these politicians in your country. Why, you mentioned Merkel before, why when members of German intelligence warned the Christian Democratic Union, don't pick Merkel, she's dangerous. Why did they pick her anyway? So who were the people picking? How many people were blackmailed who picked her? How many were just stupid or misinformed? But it turns out they were informed. So what makes them not believe the truth and make them go to something that's untrue? See, and when you look around, you see right now, most people today believe something that's not true. It's what I call it Nyquist law. Everyone believes something that someone else thinks is crazy.
Yeah.
Try that out. It's actually true. But the problem is that it turns out that most people believe something that is crazy.
You get that? I mean, you get that a lot, that when you explain something and you refer to, let's say, you refer to a certain book, or you refer to a certain, let's say, type of books or whatever, and you're just not what people, you don't say what people expect you to say. You're too complicated. You're like, because this is what I said, reality is complex and surprising and just astounding, right? And do you get that when people get irritated because it's not what they expect it to be?
They're irritated because it doesn't fit with the narrative they already believe in. And the thing is you can't be wedded to a narrative. There are things that are proved out by trial and error, that you've proved them to yourself. And even those things, there are things within them that you don't really understand as well as you think you do. So to know that, this is what I like to tell people, to know the smallest thing is extremely difficult. So what we know is like this, and what we don't know is like this.
Right.
And we have to be very clear on that. But what's amazing is that it seems like there's a lot of people that they don't know anything, but they think they have it all, because they have this narrative that they've adopted, and they're not going to let go of it for anything. And it's very hard to communicate with people that think they know the truth. There's the old story about the Catholic priest that went to the Zen Buddhist master, and he wanted to learn. And so he sits down, and the Zen Buddhist master does the Japanese tea thing, and he starts pouring tea into a cup, and the tea pours over the cup and into the saucer, and it's pouring. He goes, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, you want to learn about Zen, right? But you're like this cup. You're already full. I can't pour anything into you because you're full already." So the Zen master was giving, but that's the problem, is that so many people are already full. And they're very quick. They already know.
And they are very quick to, I mean, especially online, when it's, when people are just exchanging written text, right? Comments, social media. People are so quick to believe the other person is an enemy agent, or is just paid by some evil force. And just slight disagreements, or any disagreement, it's that fast. It's lightning fast. It's not a proper assessment. You can't just, I mean, I tell people, look at professional intelligence professionals. They keep going over things. They debate things, right? They try to figure out, do I have a bias? Am I not seeing things clearly? They just keep reevaluating. This is how professionals do it. And you can't have Russia present a narrative as quick as they possibly can when something happens. The pipeline blows up, the Nord Stream pipeline blows up, anything happens. Immediately they have a narrative, and then any sort of deviation from the narrative is declared illegal. I mean, sometimes in these, with these truthers, I feel like I'm in the Soviet Union. If you say anything that hasn't been pre-approved by certain circles, you're the devil.
Well, and
there's only a certain amount of a certain list of talking points you're allowed to say. You're not supposed to go off script.
Well, and the thing is, the problem I've had, I've argued and I've made I'm sure a lot of people hate me because, I get them coming on, I allow a chat on my site because I want people to come on and challenge me because sometimes it gives me the opportunity to address things that I couldn't do otherwise. And I did a piece on the 9/11 truth thing a couple months back, I think. And I put a lecture on there about it, which I wanted people to see because the thing is that the problem isn't what people don't know, it's what they do know that ain't so, right? That's the real problem. But how is it that you get to the truth? How is it that you can actually penetrate this? And the real problem when you're actually going to try to explain it to people is that they don't have the ability, they have not reflected on how they know what they know. They don't have, to use a fancy word, they don't have an epistemology. They don't have they don't have a self-reflective idea of how do you know this. And so my first question to people when they give me the conspiracy thing is, well, how do you know this? I had the discussion in my last article last week. I was writing about the UFO stuff that was coming out with John Grush here in Washington, and some guy was really irritated at me because I guess he doesn't believe that he's an American. He didn't believe that we landed on the moon. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, people don't know this, but my dad knew all the astronauts. He worked he was hired as the filmmaker, the on-the-ground filmmaker to do all the filming of the astronauts on the ground. Right? Yeah. So he was the guy. He would have breakfast. He lived with the astronauts while they were training and taking the movies, and he'd go to Houston Control when they'd be up in the spaceship and everything. So he was always, this is what he was doing when I was a kid. So I was 11 years old when they landed on the moon. So I remember, I don't know, I was a couple of years later, it was Apollo 17 or something. And I came home from junior high and this kid at school had said, they faked the moon landing. It's not real. And I knew my dad was just coming back from Houston Control that day. And I asked him, I said, Dad, this kid, he said that we didn't really land on the moon. And my dad just laughed and said, well, then I would have been the one to fake it, is what he said. But I remember that night, I walked out. It was a clear night in LA, in Southern California. And I walked out onto the street and I could see it was a full moon. And I could see this, it looked like a slinky, it was this circular giant contrail going all the way to the moon. And it turns out the rocket had launched earlier that day from Earth orbit to the moon. And the exhaust from the rocket had expanded in the vacuum of space. And with the moon's rays, the full moon rays going through it, you could see this thing. Yeah. And I thought, holy crap, they really did go to the moon. Just seeing that. Nobody ever mentions that the rocket did that blast. But anyway, this guy really angrily challenges me and says they didn't land on the moon because you can't go through the Van Allen belt. The Van Allen belt would fry you. They would die of the radiation. Right. So I thought, all right.
He read that on the internet. I saw it on the internet.
Right, he read it on the internet. So I just typed in Van Allen's name, and it popped up a website, and there was a letter that this guy had written to Van Allen, and Van Allen had written back on it and signed his name, and it was basically said, Van Allen said, it's nonsense that they would be killed by the radiation. Now, this was in 2004. Van Allen died in 2006. So here's Van Allen, the guy that the belt's named after, himself saying, no, it's not going to kill the astronauts. You can get through it without getting a fatal dose. He's writing it. So I just gave him a link to it, and the guy just basically just loses it. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like I said, well, this is what Van Allen says. I said to the guy, and this is what he's written. So either Van Allen has to be a liar. Do you have evidence that Van Allen is this horrible person that lies and cheats? And the guy just freaks out. He can't say anything against Van Allen.
You know what?
This gives you an example of a conspiracy. Yeah. When you confront a conspiracy person, they just get bent out of shape.
But the thing is, once a conspiracy buff, so a consumer of conspiracy media, once a person like this actually becomes an influencer himself, he will be the target of conspiracy theories against him. And then that's when they realize, wow, that fast? People come up with this stuff this fast with no evidence? I didn't even know this was possible. And I did a thing. So I was talking about the German right-wing or far right-wing politics and how I wanted to explain how a politician could get reeled in by the Russians and then gets found out by the Americans, so they recruit him as a double, and then the Russians find out about that, and so they kill him. I was just giving them sort of an example, just pieced together from actual cases, that have been documented. So, because I can remember X number of cases that I've read. Actual cases. So if I want to draw a comparison, I could always remember, oh yeah, there was this one guy who did this or this operation, that operation. But if people do not have memory of all these real cases, they find it hard to understand how an intelligence agency, how, let's say, the Russians would recruit someone. How does that even work? How would they do it? And so I tried to write something the way you write a novel. Just you have a character, and then you have like the Russian character, and the Russian intelligence service, they try to appear as this guy's friend and helper. They get him out of trouble. They try to present themselves as very, very friendly, right? And so I just wrote it as you would write a novel, and that's when people went, okay, now I get it, right? Because they haven't seen all those real cases. And so I think that actually helps a lot if you just put it into a slightly different form. It's all based on real cases, but then you show it to them like they're watching it. Let's say they watch a secret recording of a recruitment process. And I think that actually saved people time, because they can't read that many books, because they really don't have the time, because they don't do this for a living. So I think that gave a very plastic, very just a very easy way to understand how this actually happens, right? And so I told the story about this. So I told a story about this fictional guy who was based on a real guy, and how it all made sense to him. Every step of the way made sense to him. And then the Americans, they find out about him and they tell him. They lure him in. There's a fake chance first meeting. They set up a second meeting, and they tell him, well, your Russian friends were not as careful as you thought they were, but hey, we're not your enemies. We're not here to, we represent a faction of Western intelligence that is, just we try to help you out. We're all conservatives here, and then they play him. They reel him in, and now he's a double. just you have to show people how this actually works, because otherwise they just rely on these simple formulas, or they just rely on mythology.
Yeah, well, of course, one spy, GRU defector, Stanislav Lunev, told me, he said, the spy is not James Bond. The spy is everybody's friend. He's the person that everybody likes. And that's the way you want to be. And of course, when you're looking at people, it's sex, money, power, career, ego. That's what they look at. What is motivating this person? And I remember a former KGB guy told me he had been assigned at the end of the Cold War, to go into all the NATO jails to talk to all the East Bloc spies that were sitting in jail in the West. And he told me, I said, well, that's fascinating. You have to meet them all. What do they all have in common? He said they were all egomaniacs.
Yeah.
So ego was the biggest. And he said, well, of course, ego is the biggest recruitment, because somebody's hurting for some reason in their ego, and you that's easier.
Give
than
them what they need. You give them the
give
thing.
them what they need, and a lot of people are neurotic, and they need a pat on the back.
Oh, that was you probably didn't see this. In before it was banned, Russia Today, they actually had this this German presence, because they started with an English channel. Then I think they had a Spanish one, maybe even a French one, and they tried to get a television satellite license to make a German version of that Russian television station. And so they didn't get a license, so they started with web shows. They had their YouTube channel, and one of the shows was called The Missing Part. And they said, well, it's just about because Western media always lies, and we tell the missing part. But I thought, this reminds me of Russian intelligence, because they always try to find what thing it is that you're missing and that you want. And so once they know what it is, they offer it to you. And I was like, this is so weird. It's like, why would they call it this? It's just so ridiculous. But unfortunately they got banned over here, and they had to find different ways to continue their propaganda, but that really got them. I mean, that really got them when they got banned.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I might ask you a question. So in Germany right now, the right is very much. What percentage of the right would you say is just taking this pro-Russian line?
Well, I'd say, I mean, the further to the right you're getting, the more it is pro-Russia. But I think anything that is more far right, almost everybody on the far right, virtually anybody who is part of that traditional conspiracy culture, that they're almost all of them are pro-Russia. It's hard to find. It's kind of an evidence that the Russians kind of are controlling that. I myself, I tell people I'm 39 years old, right? So I'm 39 years old. I do remember things from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and I did study. I did my own study of 200 years worth of conspiracy media, right? And so it's interesting to see the different phases. Like when in the 1990s, there was nobody cared about. I mean, most conspiracy books didn't care about Russia because they just didn't talk about it. And then, of course, in 2008, it all started to change gradually. So they started to introduce things. So I saw it on the Alex Jones show. So when Russia moved into Georgia, it was sort of like, yeah, kind of okay. We shouldn't make a big deal out of it. And it was more guests that were pro-Russia. And it happened gradually. And within a couple of years, it had escalated to Putin is the savior. He's the spirit of 1776, and he knows it all, and he's gonna save us. And so this really, really escalated hard, and just I keep reminding people, I do keep reminding people things used to be different, even in conspiracy culture. And this changed so hard. Changed so hard.
Yeah, I remember Alex Jones went on. I forget what mainstream show he went on, and he defended Putin's invasion of Georgia in August of 2008.
Yeah.
And I remember that caught my attention, and I was beginning to look at the alt-right, and there's another aspect to this which has to do with the Nazi diaspora. Which connects to Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller. And as you know, at the end of the Third Reich, there was within the Third Reich a kind of battle going on between the Soviet agents and the Western agents, because the smart people knew the war was going to end and Germany was going to lose. So the question is, who do we surrender to? What side do we join? If Germany's going to surrender, do we want the West or do we surrender to the East? Is it going to be Stalin's side or the West? You had people like Walter Schellenberg, the head of AMT6, the German SS Foreign Intelligence, he was pro-Western. He wanted to surrender to the West. And at the same time, you had a group of German officers who were more and more thinking about surrendering to the Soviet Union. You had, and of course, if it's true that Martin Bormann and Mueller, the head of the Gestapo, were Soviet agents as early as 1943, you can see what the basis of the internal, almost civil war within the Third Reich was, where Schellenberg has his fortress desk, where he has 9mm submachine guns mounted into his desk with a flip switch, right? Because what if the Gestapo comes into his office? But what is interesting is that you have then under Bormann all of this gold and equipment and material going into South America, leaving the Third Reich, being transported in special U-boats and aircraft. And then you have, after the war, the Nazi diaspora, which is, according to, this was told to me by a former CIA guy, Pete Bagley, that the Nazi diaspora had been co-opted by the Soviet intelligence. Not all of it, but a significant part of the Nazi diaspora. And that is really intriguing, because then you find the leading American Nazi theoretician and probably an agent of the Third Reich during the war was a guy named Francis Parker Yockey. I don't know if you know this name or not.
Yeah. He's in one of my book chapters. He was a weird guy, multiple passports and identities.
Yes. And he went. He was basically arrested at the San Francisco airport, and I think 1961 in jail. He was found with like 50 different fake IDs, and it turned out he had been to Castro's Cuba, he had been to Argentina.
Oh boy!
And he had been to Nasser's Egypt to see Nasser, but that he had been in East Germany, and he had been in East Germany a while, working with the KGB, and at least they believe his biographer, thought he was working with the KGB, and there were indications that he believed in this an early form of Eurasianism, what Alexander Dugin is preaching. That he believed that the Russians were part of the white race, that they were going to take up from where the Third Reich left off. Yockey had written a book called Imperium under the name Ulick Varange that Willis Carto published here in the U.S. It's a very bizarre book. It's really thick. It's very strange. It's sort of Nazi mysticism, right? And he dedicates it to the hero.
I need to get a copy of that.
He dedicates the book to the hero of the Second World War, which is who, right? Of course, it's Hitler. He's dedicated the book to Hitler.
Oh no!
And it's so you have this Nazi, this American Nazi, who is working with the KGB.
Right.
And it's very interesting when we look at the Golden Dawn in Greece and who they're working with on the left, and how they all kind of look to Moscow, right? It's a very curious thing, because there's a part of the far left that is pro-Putin now openly, right? Although the Communist Party USA, for example, says, well, invading Ukraine is wrong, but it is fighting imperialism.
Right. Oh, by the way, have you one of the biggest stories, cultural stories in recent weeks, one of the big stories over here was concerning the world-famous metal band Rammstein. Have you heard about that?
Oh yeah, I know that band. Well, they had some Claire Belinsky, who I interviewed. She wrote a book about it in which she interviewed Rammstein. I don't know if you know who Claire is in Paris right now. And I interviewed her. I was fascinated by her book because it was the first book in which she, and I think correctly, said that anti-Semitism is coming back and there is a Nazi undercurrent. And she claimed it. Now, she's half Jewish, half Polish, but she claimed that that Rammstein was using kind of very subtle Nazi, suggestive of Nazi imagery. Have you heard this?
Well, I was I heard the news, right? So I heard the news that women, some of the women who went to the concerts, they're under the impression their drinks got spiked backstage, and so this became one of the biggest stories in the country. And so obviously,
the women in the band.
No. These are fans. These are fans. So
fans.
Every time the Rammstein goes on tour, there are people from the backstage crew, and they are supposed to find young fans, young women, to go to the backstage parties. And there's also a special backstage party with the singer where things get really hot and steamy. So this was kind of how they've always done it, which is, really baseline rock star behavior. But then, right, about 24 bands, about 24 women talk to reporters, and they're under the impression that their drinks got spiked backstage. And so it was this big scandal. What did the singer of the band know? Is he responsible? Did he order it? So this became like a huge thing. And I was looking at this, and I thought, well, there's a bigger dimension to this, because I remembered that the Rammstein members, they all come from Soviet Eastern Germany, and
Right.
Most of them they had played in punk bands, and the whole small punk band scene was heavily infiltrated by the Stasi, and some of the members of Rammstein, they're so communist they didn't even care about the infiltration back then. And one of the band members actually has a child with an actual female Stasi asset informant. And he only found out about that later, that she was working for the Stasi and they had a child, right? And one of the band members, I think it's the keyboarder, he said, well, he really doesn't care, because we were all friends. He doesn't care if his friends worked for the Stasi and could have arrested everybody. He just doesn't care. We're all friends. So I remembered that. So I thought, well, maybe there's something bigger going on. Maybe this is not just a standard criminal investigation. So first, I find out that it was the whole band became famous, even in America, even in Russia. The whole band became famous because the left-wing Social Democrats in Germany, the left-wing Social Democrats in the 90s, they had this music agenda. And I'm talking about the highest-ranking Social Democrats that are in government right now. They had this idea. They did not want... This was the early 90s, right after the fall of communism, supposedly. They said, we do not want the German youth to only listen to American music. And American music in the 90s was super strong. They had the best bands and acts, everything. So they came up with this plan. They were going to start a German music television station as a competitor to the American MTV. So they had their own music television, and they had a Social Democrat run that music television station from the same party. And then they had another Social Democrat from the same party who was really hardcore communist, and he was supposed to run the music label to find new left-wing bands. And this was mostly multicultural pop acts, soft rock, and just really terrible stuff. But they also drafted Rammstein, and they signed Rammstein. And then this music was pushed on that German music television station. So they made them famous. So Rammstein is kind of the monster that the Social Democrats had started. So this was one thing that I found interesting. And the next thing was the singer of the band, who is kind of being accused of spiking the women's drinks, even though nobody knows what really happened backstage. So the singer, he was a particular nostalgic communist, in a sense. So he loved to play in Russia, many fans in Russia, and he was doing soundtrack stuff for a patriotic film concerning the Great War. He was performing on the Red Square with an old patriotic song. So he liked the old Russia, the old communist Russia, not the new Russia. But they still invited him in. They still let him play in the country. And so I was aware of that. I was vaguely aware of that. But then I found out that right after the invasion of Ukraine, the band, and especially the singer, they positioned themselves clearly pro-Ukraine. Many people have never even heard about that, and so they pissed off the Russians. The band really pissed off the Russians with that. And guess what? Guess who was in charge backstage at these concerts? Who was in charge of recruiting these young women for the backstage parties? A Russian woman. It was a Russian woman, and she looks like she looks like the stereotype Sparrow. So like, it may have been even somebody else who may have infiltrated the band's entourage, but
so you think this is Russia's getting even with them?
I think Russia has a motive to damage the band, and I think the Social Democrats who made the band famous, I think the Social Democrats want to get rid of this band for various reasons. I mean, it was the same Social Democrats who were pro-Russia, and if anybody in the press, and the press was smelling this, mainstream press, they wanted to talk about that Russian woman, they wanted to talk about that whole spy angle. Nobody dared to write anything to not piss off the government here. And so it's the most bizarre thing where the Russians have the motive to infiltrate the band to make sure they don't do anything stupid, then collect compromat, but then the band does something stupid and suddenly the scandal arises. And this was the weirdest thing, and nobody dared to talk about a possible espionage angle and a possible political angle. And there's one more bit. The band, originally, they were punk musicians. Their music was completely different from what Rammstein then became. But the biggest communist in the band, the keyboarder, he said he didn't like the music either, but he understood that this was just a means to an end. This was just meant to get the attention of everybody. And this is why the vocals are the way they are. This is why the music is the way it is. This is why they use sort of fascist imagery sometimes. It's just to get attention so they can be more popular. And the lyrics were always about something bad about, let's say the church or general society. This was just left-wing subversion, right? It was just to get people angry at traditional society or whatever. And so the whole music that they played was just a means to an end to get noticed. But
so it was a sophisticated way to get attention and to be able to put the message out.
The whole thing kind of backfired because people, on average, didn't know the band had communists in them. And many people didn't care because the music, they tried to sound as German as they could, and they really sounded German. There's something really, really German about the music. And so people liked the music, and even conservatives liked the music. And that's when it became a problem for the Social Democrats, because this was not what they had intended. They wanted left-wing music. That's why they recruited all these communist bands, and now this whole ploy sort of backfired. And so there's kind of the motive to get rid of the band, and the Russians have a motive to get rid of the band. So I'm really suspicious.
People always wanted to know why Stalin, certain people, writers or certain other people would be purged or die or disappear into the camps. And you think, or commit suicide. Who's the guy that wrote A Cloud in Trousers who supposedly committed suicide, the Soviet poet. It's a very funny thing that one misstep and the hero poet or the hero songwriter or the hero is no longer a hero anymore.
Yeah, that's it. That was, I mean, I was aware that the singer of the band was he was celebrating kind of the old school communism, because I think his father, he had to fight with for the Nazis and came back with a trauma, and so that ruined kind of the singer's childhood or something, and that's how he got into. And then, of course, growing up in Soviet East Germany, you get pumped full of this ideology, so that's why he was a communist, apparently. But he didn't like the Putin regime. He really didn't like the Putin regime, and it was
because it wasn't overtly communist, and he probably
because
didn't understand
it seemed too fascist to him or something. It was just too corporate, too fascist, and just not nostalgia. And there was one incident where the singer with a solo project, he was in Russia, and in the middle of the night, and he was scheduled to play at a festival, but that festival was connected to an opposition party, and so in the middle of the night, police arrives at the hotel, and they question the singer, and they question his manager or whatever. And they make up some stuff about their work visa and whatever, and just intimidating them to not play at that event. But somehow things got smoothed over because Rammstein was really popular in Russia, and so they kept playing in Russia until the band positioned itself pro-Ukraine, clearly pro-Ukraine. So the singer he put out photos on, I think, Instagram, showing him helping Ukrainian refugees. He was never once criticizing the Putin regime directly. He just positioned himself pro-Ukraine. And then the scandal somehow miraculously appeared, and the woman who scouted the fans is a Russian woman who looks like a freaking sparrow, who went to sparrow school. I mean, tell me I'm dreaming, but...
What's interesting about this story is it shows how the law of unintended consequences. If Russia had defeated Ukraine in a matter of days or a couple of weeks, none of this would be an issue, would it?
Yeah.
It's very interesting. The minute Russia fails in Ukraine, this double game that Russia's playing, where you get all these people on the left pretending to be against Putin and Putin pretending to be on the right, it suddenly blows up in their face.
Yeah, it really did. Yeah, this was just
deception.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many more people listening to bands like Rammstein than read books. So that's why it's an issue for the Russians. And I put out a couple of videos, on my channel in Germany, just explaining the baseline of the case. And nobody in the press was talking about the political background in the Russians, even though this was fairly easy to reconstruct, right? I mean, there's even old stuff from the label guy that Rammstein was on, where he was quoting Stalinist literature in his youth, and then he sort of figured he has to get into the music industry. He can't just be a independent producer of punk music. He has to get into a capitalist corporation. I think it was the head company, I think was Universal. But he had this niche, this communist little niche, and he told the capitalist guys, yeah, it's just about making money. But then he told the guys he was signing, no, it's mostly about ideology. And so he was back. I mean, this was, I think, in Spiegel magazine. He was quoting Stalinist literature back in his old days. And so I put out some videos about that, explaining that. And some people they just they told me, why do you think the Russians would care? I mean, the Russians are busy in Ukraine. Why would they care about the band? And I'm like, on what planet do you live on? This is one of the most successful bands in the world, and they've been pro-Russia, but they're not really now. And this
is what the Russians are actually competent at doing. They're not.
Do you know how cheap it is? Do you know how cheap it is to place like 2-3 assets in the band's entourage and have people in the center work on that? And it's just like, this is cheap. This doesn't even cost money. Like, this doesn't cost much money. What are you thinking? What do you mean you don't understand why the Russians would infiltrate the band? So it's
It's interesting. I didn't know. I'd only heard about Rammstein. I only knew about them because I read Claire Berlinski's book, which she interviewed.
I mean, it probably goes even deeper than what I've come up with so far, because it's not a coincidence that the Rammstein musicians, when they were East German punks, right? It was not legal to be a punk musician, an unlicensed musician, charging money for, not much money, but charging money for shows. You needed to have sort of a phony job, like a half-day phony job in communist Eastern Germany. And then if you had like 1-2 shows a month and charge money for that, you could afford rent, you could afford food, and you could live the life of a punk musician. But the whole scene was so infiltrated by the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi, they could have arrested everyone. They could have arrested literally everyone, but at some point, apparently, somebody from higher up in the Stasi thought, maybe we could recruit punks, and then use it to infiltrate Western punks. And then you hear that this
makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and then you hear like the certain music label guy from the West. He was communicating with punk bands from Eastern Germany, and they sent him tapes, and I'm like, this is crazy. There's probably an even worse background to this. Some old networks, and then the Social Democrats in the 90s, and they tried to influence music. They wanted people to hear not American music, but other music, and so this became this whole crazy thing. That was something. That was really something. But so I mean, one guy in the band is more of a libertarian. One is, I think, apolitical, and he even fled communist Eastern Germany. One is a hardcore communist, and the singer is sort of a nostalgic communist. So that's what the band, this is how the band is. But
politics is downstream from culture, they say. So what is so important about a band? It's very important.
Yeah, I did this. So
as you say, people don't read.
Yeah, I did this. So, and people ask me, what do you mean intelligence agencies got involved in music? And I'm like, there's books about this. There's so many instances about this. When the Rolling Stones, when they crossed the Berlin border, Mick Jagger he threw out the butt of his cigarette out of the tour bus window, and so the communist border police, they made a whole big scene out of this, and so they forced Mick Jagger to pay 200 Deutschmark for the cigarette. And within a few hours, the highest levels of the Stasi had a report about Mick Jagger's cigarette, because they wanted to know everything about the band, because it was allowed. I think they played in Poland, but they were not allowed to play in Eastern Germany, I think, for a while. And so they wanted to know everything about the band. Will they do something stupid? And so, imagine the high-ranking Stasi guy reads about a cigarette, right? Because it's that important to them. So now people ask me, why do you think the Russians would care about Rammstein? Well, because it's this massively successful band.
And why do communists want to destroy the careers of certain writers or certain artists or certain performers? Certain Hollywood people who became conservative, from then on became difficult for them to get work in Hollywood, like Ronald Reagan, who then went into politics.
Oh yeah, and he just I mean, it's just this whole bit where I mean, how would you damage the band? What is the only way to damage the band? I mean, what's the only scandal that would stick? It would be like a Me Too scandal, right? Because people assume that the singer takes drugs. I mean, people know they're rock stars. But the only thing you could pin on this band would be sort of a groupie sex scandal in this day and age. And there's this one person who was in the media, this woman, And she told a story that, she was she was recruited by this Russian woman working for Rammstein. And she was lured into this whole thing. Yeah, it's just a normal kind of backstage party. And then she was maneuvered into a certain section behind the stage or below the stage. And then the singer would appear. The singer of the band expected to have sex with that woman. Woman refused because she never agreed to that. And the singer allegedly, because this is all according to her testimony, the singer allegedly was angry and said something like, "But they told me otherwise." So if this verbal exchange took place, then he was most likely referring to his backstage crew. He relies on the backstage crew. They get the women, and somebody from the backstage crew may have been lying to the women, lied to him, and spiked some drinks. And
easy to set it up.
Yeah, and in
What
intelligence circles,
this
is the most baseline intelligence imaginable. If this is what that was, I mean, they do this every day.
Did they actually have tests to show they were spiked with something? Or
No,
was that just...
no, because usually the women, it took days for them to, go to the police and file a report, and there is nothing left in their bloodstream, and so there's no hard evidence. And I said this from the get-go: if nobody from the bands incriminates himself, if nobody from the backstage crew incriminates himself, the investigation will go nowhere. So nobody, the press, nobody knows who did what. Why is the press attacking the band and the singer so hard? There were newspapers. I mean, even mainline conservative newspapers. They've written a bunch of stories about Russian operations and Russian intelligence. They know how this works. And I read their stories. They talk about that Russian woman in the background. And they know. They have to know. They have to know there's an intelligence angle, but they're not writing it. And guess who runs the government right now? It's the same. I mean, literally almost the same people who made Rammstein a big deal in the 90s because they had this whole plan figured out for pop culture.
Now, I have a question for you about the coalition in Germany, the ruling coalition, Chancellor Scholz, and of course, Baerbock is the co-leader of the Green Party. The Greens seem that they've gone over to Ukraine, and I know that Scholz and the Social Democrats, they have to be on the hook to Russia. They have to be uncomfortable with this. I'm sure they want to find a way to credibly go back and not be supporting Ukraine. So how do you see this? How is this played out? And, is Scholz squirming to get out from this? Where is this headed?
Well, first of all, the Green Party used to be crazy pro-Russia. I mean, they sent their people over to Russia. Send their people to Russia, gushing over everything, but that has significantly changed. So most important people in the Green Party, they're more aligned with the United States, and because climate science is dominated by America and Britain, and they're more pro United States now, far more. And the Social Democrats, on the other hand, they are the weirdest thing you could think of. I mean, this was a few months into the invasion of Ukraine. There was New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, they interviewed former Chancellor, former German head of state, Gerhard Schröder, right? Mm-hmm. So they asked about him. Well, you were pro-Russia, and what do you think now? And he said, I'm doing the same thing other chancellors have done. And it was kind of after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the main priority was to get Russian tanks out and to have some sort of stability. So that was kind of his argument, right? So that you have to accept Russia, you have to accept Putin. It's better than more chaos. Same thing the New York Times is now saying about we have to stick with Putin, and so it's really hard to say because the Social Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party after 1945 was rebuilt by Britain and America in the occupied zones. So there's kind of this intelligence battle going on between American intelligence and the British intelligence, their influence on the Social Democrats, and then the communist Eastern KGB influence on the Social Democrats. So it's really hard to tell who is playing for what side, so a lot of people in the Social Democrats traditionally they're aligned with Western intelligence, but there's also quite a bunch of them who are seem like hardcore communists. So it's really hard to tell.
Scholz, do you think he could be a double agent working for the Americans? The British?
It's thoroughly realistic. I've looked at this guy's whole life and his whole background, and he came from a more affluent background, and I think this whole Hamburg area. This was supposed to be. He came from a more affluent background, and he became this big shot for the youth organization of the Social Democrats. And when he was in his 20s, when he was a young guy, he was, pretty much a nobody. He was invited multiple times to communist East Germany, where he was treated like an important politician. So they gave him the red carpet, and the Stasi wrote reports. Yes, he says he's anti-NATO. He says the right things, but I'm not sure. I think he could be working for the West, but it's really hard to tell with the Social Democrats.
It's very funny that this invasion of Ukraine happened after Merkel left. After these people, it was just a couple months later, these people come in, and it's very strange. And of course, Baerbock is a kind of strange, odd kind of duck, huh?
Yeah. Well,
what do you make of her?
Well, she was thoroughly unqualified for the job. She studied a bit, and then she got the option of doing 1 year at the London School of Economics, and this somehow opened all the doors for her, and to have that in her, to have that happen, to have that degree, right? And then she became this big shot, but she has thorough British connections. There are multiple British connections, so she's probably more Western, and she even grew up right next to the beautiful, castle of the same families who run the university, the London School of Economics. So there may be some family background, maybe some ancestor was, an illegitimate child or some housemaid of the nobility or something like that. She's probably working for the West, but this one thing that the Social Democrats, especially the Social Democrats, did after 1991. But I think this was agreed upon on a higher level, was the destruction of the German armed forces. So the German armed forces were pretty decent during the Cold War, but they're now completely shattered. And even though there's a war in Ukraine, nothing really has changed. There's been a lot of talk.
Was it Ursula von der Leyen that kind of started that? I started reading about the problems with the German military after she came in, but it goes back further than that, doesn't it?
Who exactly? The
von der Leyen. She was a German defense minister some years ago.
Oh, von der Leyen. Yeah, of course. But she had, she was thoroughly pro-West, and see, that's the thing. Mm-hmm. See, that's the thing.
She's very odd. She's very deceptive in a way, isn't she?
Yeah. But she's got like a Ursula von der Leyen. She's got now. I think she's like a double aristocracy angle to her. So her family
she projects an aristocratic image.
Yeah, she married an aristocratic family, but herself, her own family, was a special privileged family in Hanover, which is the origin of the modern British throne, And there's many people from Hanover who became important, like Barings family with the Barings Bank and so on. So I think she's pro-Western. But the one thing that Schröder said in the New York Times interview, and I've saw the same thing said by people in the German government, even conservatives, they all kind of confirmed the same thing. It was a negotiation between Washington and Moscow, and even German heads of state, they were not allowed into that. They were not allowed to be part of that negotiation. And so when the negotiation was over, the terms were then handed down. So this was basically handed down to, let's say, German head of state, and they were told, okay, this is the deal now. This is kind of the best we could get. And so this is what was one of the defenses of Gerhard Schröder when he was talking to the journalists. He was saying, I mean, he was indicating, because he didn't have direct knowledge of these meetings, of these negotiations. He basically said, I've done what was expected of me and what was generally agreed upon. And so, yeah, there's some truth to that, but there's always kind of some actual communist agents in the Social Democrats, I mean, they would jump at any opportunity to use an excuse like this. Something has been agreed upon. Let's just go overboard with it, right? Let's do the pipelines and go completely crazy with the pipelines. So communist agents, they would actually just, use an opportunity like this. So it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to tell over here because Germans, I mean, traditionally Germans have no intelligence culture whatsoever. I mean, some, but not really. Germans have been terrible at intelligence and overall. And then, of course, when Germany was split, Germany was infiltrated by so many different agents. It becomes like this monumental task to understand who is who and who works for whom. It's really complicated.
It was interesting. The one spy chief that the Soviets feared the most in World War II. Do you know who that was?
German?
The head of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris.
Canaris, Oster?
Yeah, he was. Now, what's interesting is that his image as being some kind of a traitor to the British, right?
Yeah, he was looking for help. He was looking for help.
I've read a couple biographies of him, and the story is rather extraordinary. I think he was very famous in World War I for being the intelligence officer on a British cruiser, on a German cruiser that actually won a battle off the coast of Chile, and then got trapped. You maybe know the story. But he became a very famous German spy in Spain and Italy during World War I, ended up becoming the head of the service before World War II. But the reason I bring it up is that some very unusual people, whereas I think both the Germans and the Americans have this trait that they don't do very good at espionage. I think it's true of the Germans and the Americans. And the British, and the British have a tradition, I think that the Russians have been the people who are best at this game in the world. But it looks like the new generation of Russians may not be as good at it.
Yeah, they had some pretty spectacular...
The last few years.
Spectacular failures, not. There's one thing, I mean, you probably read this book, right? Catherine Belton, the Catherine Belton book about Putin's cronies and how the money was moved.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, what is it? Putin's People?
Yeah, I think, exactly. That was called Putin's People.
There's jabs against Trump in there.
There's one anecdote in this thing that really stumped me, and this is something I've been working on for a while. So she tells a story. So the author, she tells a story. She has a source, some guy who works in finance, big shot finance guy, and this source told her about I think it was the old Metternich Castle in Hessen-Darmstadt, right? Mm-hmm. Famous castle, and uh, so it tells a story that back in decades ago, many decades ago, the one of the people who lived in the castle, she was a Russian princess who had married into the Metternich clan, and so in this castle there was a visitor, and it was a young KGB agent, Vladimir Putin. So he was still a younger guy, visited there, and this was kind of like a weird episode. It's like this weird little anecdote, and I thought, but wait a minute, for example, when the founder of a far-right party, an older far-right party in Germany, when the founder was unmasked after his death as a British agent, right? So he had an aristocratic. He was from an aristocratic family, and so I guess it was easy for the British to approach him, right? Would be easy to approach him and recruit him. And so after he got recruited, the Russians tried to recruit him, and the Russians pretended to be the Brits. And so
flag recruitment. Yes.
So when that came out, there was people commented on this in the press. Even some German intelligence officials commented on this, and they said, yeah, this was actually standard procedure of the Russians to pretend they were British. Now, obviously, because of the Russian history, they still may have significant assets in aristocratic circles. And so that's maybe some of the things they have used in the past a lot. Maybe that's why a young Putin supposedly visited that specific castle. Hessen-Darmstadt, that's basically the family of the Tsars. So this is something I tell the right-wingers. Watch out if some people approach you and they say, oh, we're the Brits and we're the aristocratic people. You might be dealing with the Russians. So be aware of that, right? So...
And in the U.S., they pretend to be Mossad.
Really?
Yes,
because there's Israelis that look like Russians, and there's Russians that look like Israelis.
And there's a among conservatives, many are pro-Israel.
Yeah.
So you see, it's
difficult.
I'm spying for a friendly country, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell who's whom.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some, but over here you have so many different groups and individuals, and it's all very, very opaque. And I recommend to people, learn how the intelligence game works, learn how to build your own skills to judge things, judge people, and then let's try to be transparent. Let's try to have transparency, because you can't chase every last single agent. Sometimes you really can't tell whom somebody's working for, but you can tell this person is suspicious. Why would you take the risk with this person? I mean, it's just like with the the American spy catchers. They always said it's easier to find out somebody is a spy. It's far easier than to convict him of espionage in a court. Because if you're a pro, you're a professional, you recognize an enemy professional and he's a spy, but it's a lot harder to prove in a court. Because you have to catch him in
impossible.
Because you literally have to catch him in the moment with the microfilm, with the hidden floorboard thing, and just it usually doesn't happen. It's just you need more professional.
Germany was a crossroads in the Cold War. Was the, Checkpoint Charlie and all the rest. You were the ground zero for the spy war in Europe, and so it becomes a nexus. And so maybe many Germans don't realize that was going on in your country, and there was just a huge amount of effort going on from a number of countries using your country as a springboard. And so it's one way to look at it. And of course, the number one thing is why do people do the things they do?
Yeah.
and why do they say the things they do? And there is a pattern, and it can be deciphered.
My last question would be this. So Russia moved into Ukraine. Poland, of course, is very concerned, and they're buying lots of tanks, and they're trying to defend themselves. And how far do you think the Russians can push this? Can they push into Poland? Could they regain part of Germany? I mean, there's left-wing people in Eastern Germany right now who want to go back to under Russian control, and there's right-wing people in Eastern Germany. They want to go back to Russian control, and they're actually gaining in the polls, and so they would be okay with being under Russian control. So, is this going to be a repeat of the old days? Is this going to be?
It's really hard to say. Wars are hard to predict, but and I've studied military things most of my life, and what I would say is that the Russians had a bad stumble in Ukraine, so their military is not doing so well. So it doesn't seem likely that they could do it this year. But you go a year out, if this war continues, the Russians have this ability to wear people down.
Yeah.
And Ukraine is already, there's signs of war weariness in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country with a third of the population of Russia. And of course, what you've got is you've got this tremendous Russian propaganda and infiltration of the right wing, both in the United States and Germany, which is likely to have some kind of effect. And then there's also the left-wing puppets and the other people. So if this war goes another year or two, you could see a situation where Russia is able to reorganize their military and are able to then strike effectively and collapse Ukraine. Especially if the West if like Trump wins the election and Trump starts to cut things and they start people, you can demoralize a war-weary country by threatening to cut the support if they don't negotiate a peace. And then they just collapse because they've lost hope. Psychologically, you've damaged them. So it's a very delicate thing, and wars are psychological. I believe in Clausewitz that it's about breaking the will of one side or the other. And Russia's really been tested, and so is Ukraine. And if that should ever happen, I think it's going to take some time, but it could be a year from now, 2 years from now, Ukraine could break. Then that would bring the Russian forces, if they've improved their organization, if further crisis mobilizes the system, if Russia passes its crisis, they could be on your doorstep. On the other hand, Russia itself could go the other way, completely the other way. Russia could end up collapsing. So it's such a strange war in that I believe it could go other way depending on how the war is managed, how the U.S. and Germany and other countries behave, what happens internally in Ukraine and in Russia. So it's really, but it is possible that Russia could win the war. And it could be really bad for Europe. And we don't understand. I don't think people understand how bad it could be. But
I mean, some Russian dude who's responsible for troop recruitment. He talked about maybe they're going to get 500,000 North Koreans to enter this war. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is, but I mean, just
North Koreans
putting out the idea, just putting out the idea, it has a psychological effect because it's not impossible to do. And I told this to right-wingers, to conservatives. I mean, you may see Asian, North Korean communists in Europe. You could actually see that. And they're taking selfies and they're just, they're looking for more. This is not too far away,
Yeah.
Man, that's crazy.
No, it is pretty crazy.
Well, it was great talking to you. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, and I'd like to send you some notes, stuff I've been working on, because there's just things over the years that I noticed, and some things that I don't see anybody else working on. So I thought this was probably a good idea to go that way. I'm just gonna send you some notes. Do you have anything you're working on right now? Do you have a new book or something?
Yeah, I'm trying to get through the news during the day and to try to figure out what to write. But yeah, I'm interested in a couple things. I'm interested in the corruption that exists in both the West and the East, and I'm interested in this you could say this theory of stupidity, where things are degenerating, things are getting worse. How do things get better? Why are people accepting of all this false narratives, and where is this leading us? And of course, I've been working on my jrnyquist.blog is my site, and I encourage people to go there. But I'm kind of working through things and trying to figure out. I've been reading actually philosophy, trying to find answers in different things, and so I think that the answers are there, and it's just a matter of plowing through what's going on and trying to figure it out. But it may be that we're facing a kind of collapse of civilization both in the East and the West, sort of a general move.
People need to be smart. I mean, I tell this to people all the time. I mean, when I was a teenager, was a young teenager, I didn't read, so I was functionally stupid. It's garbage in, garbage out. I mean, you really have to read. It doesn't matter what your natural IQ may be. The smarter the stuff you read, I mean, the better decisions you can make. I mean, I remember this one proper book written about John J. McCloy. Remember the guy?
Oh yes, I have that book. Oh yeah, very important person in history. Very important for Germany.
yeah, exactly. So he was running, post-war Germany here, and he was kind of the guy for everything, right? He came from a very humble background, and then he got more and more and more responsibilities. He was supposed to figure out how to scale up the United States military. He was supposed to figure out intelligence matters and this and that. So he was the guy for everything at some point. And his philosophy was just run with the fastest, right? So if you run with the fastest people, you may not ever be the fastest, but you're going to be really pretty damn fast. And so he used to read on every important topic he was concerned with. He wanted to read 5 books, and each had to be of a completely different standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so he was almost a bit like Napoleon, who was also reading more than anybody else. And that's, Napoleon became really successful for a while. It's really that factor, right? If people they read on their own, and they try to find the best stuff to read, and they are disciplined about it, and that makes a lot of a difference.
You have to read. You have to keep exploring, because our own existence, our experience is so limited. Books give you the vicarious experience of other people in history, the very careful thoughts and calculations of philosophers and political scientists and sociologists, economists. So you get so much, you get dimensionality, and you get different ways of understanding things. And if you don't have that, you're really at sea trying to figure things out. And that's the problem in it. And of course, there's how you train your mind to analyze things. You have to have some analytical ability. You really do. You have to be able to think things through, and maybe you have to be able to be a little pissed off.
Yeah. When
you see certain things.
Yeah, and I mean, you gotta have a sense of humor, man. You gotta have a sense of humor, and I always tell people, learn from the winners. Winners, they employed intelligence methods, and they were able to gauge reality, and that's what made them successful. So you better learn from the winners and not from the losers who just followed blindly some ideology and ended up in a really bad spot. That's something. I mean,
ideology is bunk. Stay away from it.
oftentimes I get this reaction. Why do we need books? That books are just theory. I'm interested in the practical things. And I'm like, who do you think wrote these books? Those were professionals who spent years or decades in a practical field. I mean, you can have books by actual spies or people who ran spies. They condensed their whole Korea into these 400, 500, whatever pages, so you don't have to repeat the same work that he did. They try to get the best bits of their whole career into one book, and it takes you maybe 12 hours to read. So this is not theoretical stuff. This is just made by people who really did these things.
Well, the great historians and thinkers often are people who aren't academics, which is surprising. The greatest historian was Thucydides, and you'll hear that repeated by 19th century historians. And you have to say, well, why did they think he was so great? He was just a failed Athenian general. It was a failure in his career, right? He got fired. He got sacked for losing a city. Got blamed for it anyway. And so he writes this history, which is just amazing because it's so full of interesting insights. And so the thing is that it's the people that think the hardest about what is in front of them and then can articulate it and express it. And that's who you can learn from. So the great books, and it goes back to the Greeks taught us, the ancient Greeks, are the ones that really taught us about this. So that everything that partakes of that later on, also much of that partakes of that greatness. And it's almost like a disease. The Greeks caught it, and then the rest of Europe caught it. And we all have it in some degree in us. And if you don't go to the ancients, you won't be able to fully understand modernity.
Yeah. All right, then. This was great talking to you. And now I have to translate the whole thing because we're going to publish it, of course, the original version, and then, of course, the German translated dub version. So I have to translate all of it. But I think now, because I haven't actually translated that much or transcribed that much audio in a while. I think nowadays the software will create a transcript, and then I just have to check it and correct it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then
really?
you can, and then
no kidding.
And then I used to do this by hand. I mean, I was so good doing this by hand, but then the modern translation programs, they have improved significantly. So all I have to do is to correct the mistakes that it makes. I mean, they used to be so bad that were unusable. I always used to do this by hand, completely just translating it bit by bit, just but nowadays you get electronic helpers, but you still have to do your own thing to it, and then things go much quicker. This is gonna be
good.
This is gonna be a good opportunity.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful, wonderful thing to do. Send me your notes. Send me what you're reading. I'm so interested. Sorry, I botched van der Leyen's name. And in English, when you see I forget. In German, when you see the Y, you pronounce it as
get. Here's the thing. I mispronounce so many names because I read mostly. I do not watch television a lot, so oftentimes you never hear these names pronounced. You just read them a million times. So
and the other problem is Americans mispronounce the German names, and then we hear the mispronunciation of other English speakers.
Yeah, and you get used to that. Yeah. You get used to that.
You end up doing it. You're going, wait a minute, that's not. It's like when because I studied German. I've never been to German, so I'm not fluent, but I studied it, so I know how you're supposed to say it. Because if you can spell it, you know how it's pronounced, right? That's one great thing about German. It's bad about English, but.
It's like. I mean, you can. I mean, over here you can draw a line.
Yeah. In English, if you see it spelled there, you don't know what it is until you've heard an English speaker say it.
That's it. Yeah. Now I'm gonna send you some interesting notes and probably some. I wanted to do this anyway. I'm gonna create sort of a compilation of bits from my books, and then have it in the suitable order and run it through a translation and then correct it, and so that I can just have something.
How many books have you written?
More than 10 over the last let's say 15 years. 15 years.
Wow. And none of them have been translated into English?
No. No, no. And it's just I keep a list of what I have read, so I know where I'm more knowledge or less knowledge. So I keep this list, and at some point, when because every time I quote something or every time I talk about, oh, there's this great book and there's this great book, I always wanted to have a list. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I always want to have, I always want to have that list, and so I produce so much material, and so so it's more than 10. It must be more than 10. It's focused on the three superpowers, and it also gets into older intelligence networks. Something that is that the Russians have been using. So aristocratic networks, so they can pretend to be right wing, they can pretend to be British, and so that's something that I've gotten into because there's some old families that are really tied to Russia, and
well, also in Hungary, and it's probably the same in Germany. In Hungary, the middle class had British sympathies. And in Germany during the war, we know that a lot of the aristocrats had these British sympathies.
Yeah.
So you have different classes that have these national associations of other countries that they send their kids to school, or they have relationships because they're trading with them or whatever. That's interesting. Wow. I there's a whole world of things to know there. Wow, your knowledge is in this area is important. It's to understand what's happening in Europe now. It seems to me it's really hard because the past seems to be going away. The past structures seem to be breaking down, and something new is percolating under the surface. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, of course. And something that I notice is that it becomes, for active people in intelligence or from political operatives, it becomes harder for them to get a grasp of the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years, because they need it for their work, but it just becomes a lot for them, right? Because they can't spend too much time on the past because they have to work in the now. But it took me quite some years to get on a way more professional level. It just takes time, right? And so it's many people who are operatives today. They're severely lacking in the background of who they're working for. Right, there's so many.
When I talk to KGB, when I've talked to KGB and GRU guys, and I talk to CIA guys, I'm not impressed with the CIA guys at all.
Yeah,
the CIA people don't impress me, and I've talked. And of course, I talk to KGB and GRU guys that are my age or older. So that is a different generation to the younger ones. But a lot of the CIA people, not all of them, are about my age, and just terribly stupid. I'm sorry, just terribly stupid, and that's disturbing to me. I don't know if you have many spies you've talked to, but and so when you read,
do you know how tiny? Do you know how tiny German intelligence agencies are? They're so tiny, and they used to be even smaller. So, so the chances of, I know someone who knows someone who's in the Foreign Intelligence Service.
Have you read the memoirs of Schellenberg?
No, I haven't yet.
Please read them, because he was a gifted, natural spy guy, and his writings, I wish he'd written more, but I think he was poisoned. He died of cancer, might have been given a radioactive cocktail.
A spy's spy, so to say. Yeah. I try to motivate people. I try to motivate people to get into, spy culture and just to, kind of the quality spy culture, and not just, let's say, okay, somebody's an operative, somebody who knows how to recruit a source and then set up meetings, but kind of, the deeper aspects of it.
Yeah.
And get people motivated, right? Because it's just, I tell people, there's so much actual, let's say, scientific grade literature on espionage, and there's no replacement for it. So you can have any ideology as a replacement for it. You can have conspiracy culture as a replacement, because it's not the same thing.
No.
Conspiracy buffs tend to think they're experts on intelligence, but they're not. And if you question if they fail on a basic thing, fail at any basic thing, and you ask them, what's your 3 favorite, or what do you think are the 3 most important books on this subject? They don't have read anything, so they only have consumed conspiracy media. And I think it hit me a couple of months ago when I think Alex Jones was in court for this Sandy Hook thing, the Sandy Hook thing, right?
Yeah.
And I tried to do the numbers in my head, right? So if he has a baseline audience of 3 million people, right? And if every one of these 3 million people listen to him for 1 hour a day, I think that's 1 billion hours per year.
Yeah, wow.
So I thought,
wow,
that is I think, so it's like 365 days.
What a waste of time.
times 3 million people times 1 hour is like, it's like 1 billion hours wasted. That is that is a lot. And then they did the money. They did the money numbers. Okay, his store, it took in so many, 160 million.
All that
gross revenue,
sells.
Gross revenue, 160 million in 3 years, and then there's sponsorships, and there's this and that. So I'm thinking, man, I mean, just how much time and money does the average activist have per week, per month? It may be a couple hours, maybe $100, maybe this, maybe that. If you can get to absorb this with a big vacuum, right? You just take away all this money and all this time. Imagine what trained professionals, intelligence professionals, what they could do with, let's say, $160 million and 1 billion man hours of work. Imagine what magic you could perform with that workforce and that money.
Maybe that already is their magic, and Alex Jones is their project.
Oh God,
it's possible.
Oh God.
I gotta go.
I mean, it's past.
My mom is calling
it's
me.
It's past midnight here. It's my time zone.
My elderly mother, but I gotta go. I'm sort of taking care of her. So, but anyway, it's been great. Let's do this again.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right.
Take care. See you in a bit.
Bye-bye.